It all started in the coastal city of Wellington, which was located on the western edge of the Reichian. The girl who was Karen Prime finally got out of the carriage after an incredibly long ride. She had amazing long red hair, which she braided into a tight ponytail, and as she got out of the carriage, she stretched because her whole body was numb. It was indeed a long way from the region to Wellington, so the journey took longer than Karen had expected. The girl was a countess and the head of the Reichian administration. As soon as she got to the right place, she immediately took out a very special book that had a green cover. She was already tired of digging through the lists of aristocrats, so she also got the necessary list in which she crossed out several names and looked for the one she needed. And finally, the lathe found the very name that she needed. His name was Eric Rotger. In fact, the reason she came to such a distant region was to find the Regan Crown Prince. The place where she lived was exactly Rehin. It was a country that was ruled by Queen Sonetti, and she was called a living deity. This outstanding personality was born from the union of an angel and a demigod. She was truly a delightful woman, and it was she who assessed Karen's dissertation as outstanding and appointed her to a government position. Thanks to this, under the patronage of the queen, the girl was able to receive a knighthood and immediately began to solve many of the problems of their country. And as a result, already at the age of 20, she received the title of countess and the title of sage. Karen really achieved a lot of success while still very young. In fact, the problem for her was that she did not want to be queen at all. So she came with these words directly to her mentor. Then the queen demanded that in that case Karen bring her successor, since she herself did not want to take this position. The girl, hearing about this, was very shocked. At first, she did not understand how she was supposed to do this, but eventually she came to terms with the situation. She was very sad that the queen had taken and thrown such a huge stone into her recently established life, and this really made her quiet everyday life very difficult. When the queen saw Karen's worried look, she asked the girl if she knew why this country was perfect. The young lady immediately replied that it was because Her Highness was a deity. Then the queen continued to smile and said that in that case she should have known what would happen to this country if she were gone. Karen knew this fact very well, that Recon existed thanks to the reign of Queen Sonetti, and accordingly if she is gone it will bring many troubles. Ultimately, the Reichian, in which this queen will not exist, will simply go, and the girl was perfectly aware of the danger of this whole situation. Sonetti smiled happily and said that she is very tired of those who try to solve any problems through her. And besides, father left the throne when he turned 40 years old. In a few years, she will be the same age, so during these 5 years, she needed Karen to create a new king. The next king had to be greedy, cunning, and shrewd, a man who would seize on one thing and not let go of the rest. Smiling, Sonetti said that if the girl did not want to be taken away from what she had worked so hard to achieve, then she had to carry out this order. In fact, her family always despised Care. They did not understand how she could not become the cardinal's concubine and cover for her own sister. They didn't understand how it was possible to run away after falling in love with some old man. Her mother also said that if she had known that it would happen like this, she would have at least gotten more money out of him. In the end, it had been 7 years since Karen heard those terrible words and broke away from her family. At the age of 14, she left her hometown, leaving only scars after that, and was even able to rise to the rank of countess. Of course, the girl was very proud of her achievements. So she could not allow the Russians to fall. She was going to try to create a new king and do everything in her power to prevent terrible events. Therefore, Karen said that she understood everything during these years. She would definitely find and prepare a successor for the queen, so she could rely on the girl and not worry about it. Sonetti was very pleased with this. She smiled happily and said that this was the wonderful answer she expected to hear from her. And since that moment, some time has passed and Karen has been actively carrying out the queen's order. But it was not as easy to do as she thought. Despite the fact that it was said that the girl could choose herself, she had already spent several months. But out of almost 100 candidates, all had moved out. And in the end, only the son of the hereditary Duke of Rutbihut remained. The girl was already incredibly tired and had lost all hope. In fact, the hereditary Duke renounced the throne, but his son retained the right of succession. The Crown Duke. Eric was supposed to be Karen's last hope, so she went to a remote city to find and meet him. She finally came to the right place, where she was met by a woman at the reception and told that they were chasing the mansion of the heir to Hertz because the devil himself lives there. Karen, hearing from the devil, was very surprised and took some meat from this woman to eat after the journey. The saleswoman said that it was all true. Because of this devil, the atmosphere in the mansion became very gloomy. Also, Some said that the hereditary Hertz was proud of the real devil in the flesh and he went completely mad. And that is why no one was going to come there anymore. This woman advised Karen not to go there under any circumstances because something bad could happen to her and then no one would help her. The girl herself thought about what the hell she was talking about. In fact, she didn't believe in all this at all. And after she tried the dish that they gave her, she even grimaced. Karen, alarmed, asked what it was made of. The saleswoman said it was a local Wellington delicacy, black pudding, made from pig's blood. In the end, she had to eat it all because she was very hungry. And while she was having breakfast, she thought about this situation in which the Crown Duke turns out to be a devil, in the opinion of everyone around him. She was wondering what the catch was in this whole situation. In fact, she certainly didn't believe that there was a real devil there, so she thought that all this was just gossip from those around her. Of course, that's what she thought at first, but when she finally got to the right estate, the atmosphere there was completely unfriendly. Having seen the entire entourage, Karen thought that these were real ruins. It was hard for her to believe that anyone had ever lived there. She finally plucked up her courage and went inside, thinking that even the door was not locked at the Crown Duke's mansion, which was quite strange in her opinion. "Let's go inside." She asked for forgiveness and said that she pressed the doorbell several times. However, no one answered her, so she decided to go inside. Karen didn't even have time to finish this sentence when she suddenly heard a voice behind her asking who dared to enter this mansion. The girl immediately turned around to see who it was and saw that huge bats were flying towards her. She really hoped that all this was childish pranks. Karen opened the door slightly so that the mice could get some sunlight and they wouldn't attack her. Then she told the man who had spoken to her before that he had used the magic stone to cast a simple light spell. And when her vision finally cleared, she saw a small boy standing a few steps away from her. Karen decided to act preemptively. She quickly closed the distance between them and grabbed the guy by his cape so that he couldn't even move normally. She quickly began to look him straight in the eyes and asked who he was to indulge in such pranks in the mansion of his bright hereditary duke. She also asked that this little boy accompany her to the heir. However, the guy suddenly said in a trembling voice that, in fact, he was the hereditary duke. Karen suddenly asked if he really thought that she didn't know how old his lordship was, but the boy immediately screamed, saying that his father had died, so that only he was left. The girl, hearing about his father, was so surprised that she even let him go. At that moment, the boy's hood came off, and she saw his appearance. He had beautiful blonde hair and magnificent big blue eyes. Karen, seeing even her reflection in these beautiful eyes, asked if this really meant that he was an Eric. Karen was really very surprised because she didn't expect to see such a beautiful face. The boy, adjusting his cape, asked how she was able to find out his name. She bowed and immediately asked for forgiveness from the Crown Duke. Then she introduced herself and said that usually she was simply called Countess Monroe. As soon as Eric heard her title, he was very shocked and immediately asked why someone like the Countess came to this place. But at that moment, suddenly some servant appeared behind Karen. She began to hit the girl on the head with a broom and called her a damned woman and also told her not to dare offend their young master. Eric, seeing all this, immediately shouted at his servant Masha and asked her to stop doing this. The maid wanted to object to something. However, he calmed her down anyway. Then he turned to the Countess and asked for forgiveness for her rudeness. He said that the woman had acted this way out of concern for him. Karen was very surprised because even at home she had never been beaten with a broom. All this was very strange and unusual. She also thought that in the future, it would be necessary to request that the imidlu be recognized as a weapon. And yet she thought that Erich could become a ruler who knows how to ask forgiveness for the mistakes of his subordinates. She thought that this was a pretty good start. Then she looked at the boy again and realized that he really was quite handsome, despite the fact that he was very small. She especially remembered his beautiful blue eyes. One could look into them forever. His gaze was just telling her to touch him. But Karen was able to restrain her desire, and eventually the boy led her into something like a living room so that they could discuss all the business. Karen said that it was very surprising that the Archduke had died. Then she asked if it was true that in order to protect his Wellington line, he hid his father's death and pretended to be the devil. The boy said that this was all really true. In order to protect the Welling family, he had no other way because everyone would immediately pounce on him. At that time, he was only 15 years old and could not receive the title until he became an adult. Karen was a little amazed by all this. The child himself had come up with such a good idea. She thought that it was quite brave of him to do so, because there were risks from such a plan. It was a boy who was born with noble blood. However, he pretended to be a devil in front of everyone. Of course, this made the girl a little wary. In fact, At that moment, she had memories from childhood. How her parents locked her in a room. They were afraid that she could infect their Carla with some disease. That's why they call her a dirty blood. They told her not to leave the room all the time when the girls got some sweets. Mom scolded her and told her to share with her sister. Whenever she received any jewelry, her parents immediately took it away because they believed that she was not supposed to have such things. They always gave everything to Carla. They even called her their little angel. Therefore, accordingly, Karen was completely alone. The girl thought that she probably was the same at his age, and for some reason she even liked Erich. He was a rather nice young man. So turning to the guy, she said that it was a very bold and destructive method because after that it would be very difficult for him to restore his reputation. Maria immediately started yelling at the girl and asked what she could possibly know about how their young master had suffered. She was really very angry at Carla. Erich began to calm her down again. However, he agreed that Masha was right. He had no other choice, so he simply did what he thought was right at that moment. Karen sighed heavily and asked if there was a reason why you needed to protect Wellington by going to such extremes. She also said that one way or another, it would just be an empty title. But the guy explained that it was all because it belonged to him. He didn't want anyone to take it away, so he tried to protect it with all his might. Karen was amazed. She couldn't believe how much confidence and courage he already had. The girl also thought that this place could definitely be ideal for him, so she simply lit up with joy. Karen said that she really liked it. So in that case, she was going to make him an attractive offer that he definitely couldn't refuse. Erich asked in surprise, "Does she really mean that there is some other way to protect his place?" The girl immediately said that this was so. He had to hand over the management of Wellington to a temporary manager and go with her to the capital. She explained that there, he would become her student and would remain so until he came of age. Ultimately, further events developed very quickly in order to take the hereditary Duke Erich to the capital. As his student, there were many difficult matters that needed to be settled before that moment. But for Karen, it was not particularly difficult, and in the end, she finally finished all the paperwork very quickly. The temporary administrator who concealed the death of the Crown Duke and embezzled taxes from the estate was eventually executed, and a competent subordinate with a public-pleasing appearance was now appointed as the new manager. This manager turned out to be a young, beautiful girl who was ready to put all her efforts into not letting anyone down. However, the new manager did not like Karen's idea at all. She did not understand what the Countess was doing at all, and most importantly, why. The girl, who was, on the contrary, very happy with her work, asked the manager what had happened. "Yes, I continue to be indignant and shout." She said that this was her performance, the dress and makeup. The girl said she knew perfectly well how she hated all this pretense. However, for some reason, she still made her do it. But Karen told her to stop screaming. She needed to say hello to Erich, who was already standing behind her. Then she turned to the boy and said that this was the daughter of the Marquis of Somerset. She was supposed to manage the estate instead of the man all these years that he would be in the capital. Then she turned to Mariana and said that in front of her was the hereditary Duke Erich. The boy was a little embarrassed, so he even looked away from her for a while. But Marianne said that she was pleased to meet him, and she thought that the rumors and reality were incredibly different from each other, so she needed some time to get used to it. Erich meanwhile turned to Karen and asked if this meant that they now had to go to the capital. Smiling, the girl said that this was indeed the case, but first, she would like to put on one wonderful show that would be the finale before their departure. The next day, they gathered a large crowd and Marianne told them that her heart was breaking from the news of the death of His Grace, the hereditary Hertz Rothgers. He was the great guardian of the royal family and the protector of the outskirts, so it was a great loss for them all. In addition, the temporary manager who spread false rumors calling the young Crown Duke, who was left alone a devil, was punished by her daughter of the Somerset family. The girl also said that on this day, they wanted to see off the Crown Duke, who was leaving for study in the capital, so they now remained in her hands. Of course, people were very shocked by all this. They continued to consider him a devil, so they could not believe that he could even be taken somewhere to the capital for training. Karen, seeing their evil looks, decided to take the boy away and said that it was time for them to leave, because this way they would definitely never leave. However, when he started walking past all these people and they saw his appearance, they were pleasantly surprised. People always heard that he was a devil and a very terrible person. However, now that they saw him in person, they thought that he was more like an angel. Karen walked hand in hand with Erich past all these people who couldn't take their eyes off them and whispered behind their backs. But the girl thought that everything went well because the people's reaction was exactly what she expected. But in the end, as soon as they got into the carriage, Erich immediately turned to the girl and said that he was confused. Karen, hearing about this, was immediately surprised and asked what exactly he meant. The guy explained that for the first time in his life, he stood in front of such a large number of people, and because of this, he was very worried. Eric also said that he still doesn't know if it was the right decision to leave Wellington. He wondered if he would be able to cope with all this. In fact, when Karen looked at this child, for some reason she remembered herself from the past, and quite often these memories came to her mind. At the moment when Eric said these words, she also had a memory from the past when she lived with her teacher, and the man wanted to talk about the report at the conference. Well, the girl at that moment had a nervous breakdown, and she said that all of this was pure garbage. She didn't understand who would want to listen about hypotheses when a miracle was right before their eyes. The teacher told them to leave this country because Karen had already done enough, so she definitely couldn't have changed more. He said that this is a place where her dignity is not appreciated and it will only destroy her. The man really wanted Karen to have the best because she deserved it like no one else. The girl still couldn't understand why memories from the past started to surface so often, but she still decided to cheer up Eric because he was really worried. Smiling, Karen said that of course he could do everything. Firstly, he was very handsome and his attractive appearance was already a big advantage in their situation. The boy, hearing that she called him handsome, was very surprised. He asked if it was true, and the girl said that she thought his facial features were perfect. However, Karen said that even though he wasn't her type, he was indeed an attractive young man, so he shouldn't doubt himself. She saw how embarrassed he was, so she put her hand on his head and gently stroked his hair, trying to cheer the boy up. Smiling, Karen said in a confident voice that he would definitely be able to cope well because she personally chose him and therefore believed in him. Therefore, she wanted only one thing, that he would also trust her and live his wonderful life. For some time, the girl kept her hand on the back of his head, and the guy was a little worried. He actually had mixed feelings about Karen. Soon after several hours had passed, they finally arrived at the Montreal townhouse. This was the place where they were supposed to live for some time in the future. Therefore, Karen smiled and said that Eric and his maid Maria should go inside. Then she went inside and turned to her teacher, saying that an elderly man had already arrived. Hearing this, he was very surprised. At first, he didn't even understand who it was. His name was von Neumann, and as soon as he turned around, he saw a girl and immediately recognized her. At some point, Karen thought that he had already developed early dementia. But when the man called her a wretch, she realized that everything fell into place. Then she pointed to Eric and said that she herself now had a student. As soon as her teacher heard about this, he was very surprised and immediately asked how this could happen. But she introduced Eric to her teacher von Neumann, and also vice versa. The girl slightly nudged the guy so that he would bow as a sign of greeting, and the guy immediately did so. The teacher looked at the guy carefully. After that, he turned around and saw another woman behind Eric. After that, he asked who the lady was who was standing there. At first, Karen didn't quite understand who he was talking about. However, when she saw Masha, she immediately called her name and said that it was Eric's nanny. The woman bowed and immediately said that she was pleased to meet her. Her teacher, a little embarrassed, said that he was actually pleased too, after which an awkward silence arose between them. However, at that moment, von Neumann suddenly took Marie by the hand and asked her to allow him to show them the mansion. The woman did not object, although she herself was a little embarrassed by this. At the same time, she was very surprised. She did not understand why they behaved so affectionately with each other. It was quite strange in her opinion. But Eric turned to her and asked if she really still lived with her teacher. The girl answered that this was indeed the case. They lived together. But the boy then asked what happened to the other members of the family. In a rather rude voice, Karen replied that they were not her family. It was only the teacher, and it was unlikely that this would change in the near future. Eric was a little shocked by what he heard, but he did not develop this topic further because he assumed that the girls would find it unpleasant to talk about it. At that moment, the butler suddenly came in. He asked the hostess for forgiveness and said that the young master's room, which she had ordered to be prepared, was already ready. Karen, hearing about this, was immediately surprised. However, she said that it was wonderful and asked the butler to sort out Eric's things and also tell Maria what she needed to do. When several hours had passed since then, and it was deep night outside, Eric went to his soft bed early in order to get some sleep. But at that moment, the boy had a nightmare. He was sitting in his father's arms. However, he said that the boy did not understand anything because his bright smile was similar to the smile of his despised mother. Therefore, he should not have been born at all, just as his crown was lost because of Eric. He too will eventually be abandoned, just like his father. At that moment, his father let him go from his arms, and Eric began to fall into complete obscurity. After which, as he felt incredible fear, the guy immediately opened his eyes. He even shouted loudly to Karen, who was next to him at that moment, and asked in an alarmed voice if he was really afraid of something in his sleep. Eric, seeing his teacher next to him, was amazed. He did not understand what she was doing in his room at all, so he asked her about it. But the girl said that she came to check if he slept well and also asked for forgiveness for doing it, without asking, and asked if it was true that he had some kind of terrible dream. Eric sighed heavily and said that it really was like that. He saw in a dream the now-deceased hereditary duke, that is, his father. Then Karen realized that he really had a nightmare and assumed that his relationship with the former Crown Duke was not very friendly. That's why he continued to worry about this man. For some time, she sat in silence and tried to understand what she needed to do in order to calm the guy down. Karen felt that she really should have comforted him in such a difficult time. You see, too many things had happened in the last few days. So she put her hand on his hair again and began to stroke it with soothing movements so that he felt that he was not alone. For a moment, it even seemed to her as if she intended to raise this child as well. However, in reality, this was not the case. Karen had a completely different mission. So she got up from his bed and, leaving, asked if he had calmed down a bit after this terrible dream. She also said that tomorrow he would need to learn a lot of things and visit a lot of places, so he needed to go back to bed to get some sleep. Eric, hearing this, was amazed. In fact, he was even a little embarrassed after the girl showed him such attention. But smiling, he told his teacher that he would definitely go to bed earlier. And so when the next morning came, the guy woke up in his bed. He no longer had bad dreams. As soon as he sat up, he immediately thought that the morning was very warm. This was unusual. He remembered that the teacher said that from that day on, he would have a lot of things to do. So he needed to get up as soon as possible in order to get everything done and not let the teacher down. At that moment, he had already opened his front door but did not have time to go out when suddenly Karen ran into him, seeing the guy. She was a little surprised because she did not expect to run into him in the passage, but smiling happily, she said that she was glad that Eric had already woken up, and she also added that she had forgotten to knock, and next time she would definitely be more careful so as not to cause him discomfort. Then, she took him by the shoulder and said that since he was already up, they could go to breakfast and go about their business as quickly as possible. In the end, Eric turned out to be beyond her expectations. He had a good mind, a quick learner, and once you showed him something, he immediately understood everything. He had everything impeccable from his manners to his speech to the basic etiquette such as the dignity and quality that an aristocrat should have. So Karen was pleasantly surprised as soon as she found out about all this. He was ideal in everything in politics, economics, society, philosophy, mathematics, and even in art. He understood even those areas that were still difficult for his age, and the results were always higher than the girl's expectations. When she saw him working at his desk late at night, it made her feel incredibly warm inside. She realized that she had made the right choice. Karen seemed to see herself in her youth. She also sat at night studying in order to become better and achieve success. At some point, she even became interested in whether the teacher really felt the same way when she looked at her as she now looked at Eric. She knew that it was impossible to find a better successor. Her keen eye did not let the girl down after all, and she made the right choice, so the girl began to be even more proud of herself. So, from the moment Eric first arrived at the palace, time flew by very quickly. Many changes happened. For example, teacher Karen proposed to Maria because he fell in love with her at first sight. The girl and Eric continued to study. The boy became more open. They often had lunch, dinner, breakfast together, always discussed some interesting topics, and Karen was incredibly pleased to hear his ringing laughter. Thus, 4 years passed since he arrived in the capital. The boy was now an adult, and winter had come to Reichstag. It was also a time when the teacher's arthritis was incredibly aggravated, so he always stopped being even more grumpy in the winter. He asked her to raise the herbs a little more, but Karen did not give it to him, because she smelled of herbs much more than he thought. But the man was not satisfied with all this, because he really was in severe pain. There were also big changes, and they consisted in the fact that Masha and the teacher eventually got married, because Eric's nanny finally agreed to his proposal. From the wedding, which took place only 6 months after they met, their passionate love continued until now, and Maria always worried about her dear husband, whom she loved with all her heart. Quite often they were very friendly, so Karen could not stay there for more than 5 minutes, and this time when her teacher continued to complain about arthritis, she decided to go to Eric. There she felt calmer. It was still surprising to her that the teacher was capable of loving someone so much. However, she still tried to accept him. She also became interested in whether there was a person in the world who could change himself so much for the sake of love. Since then, Karen has thought about this word love quite often. She remembered her family in which she was only useless, and in which her sister played the most important role. That's why she always felt sad from such thoughts, and she considered them simply useless, so she put them off as long as possible. When Karen came to Eric's room, she knocked on his door and said that she would come in. As soon as the girl opened the door, she already wanted to tell him something. However, she hesitated because she saw something she shouldn't have seen. When she entered the room, Eric was just putting on his shirt to go to training. As soon as the boy heard that someone had come to see him, he immediately smiled happily and greeted the teacher. But his shirt was still unbuttoned. Karen, meanwhile, quickly walked out the door and slammed it behind her. She asked him for forgiveness and asked if he hadn't heard the knock. Then she realized that he probably heard everything. However, she didn't answer, and she simply decided to go inside. Karen was very embarrassed. She had already completely forgotten that Eric had become so grown up. After some time, she finally came into the room again and said that it was time for work, but he had not yet come out, so she decided to come and call him herself. Eric, who had already gotten dressed in the meantime, came closer to her and said that he would immediately prepare for everything. After that, he suddenly took her hand because he wanted something else. He suddenly ran along her neck and said that the collar of her shirt was raised from behind, after which he tried to fix it himself. But of course, Karen didn't like it. The girl immediately jumped back and thanked him for noticing this, and she quickly began to correct it. All this so that he would not start approaching her like that again. She couldn't help but wonder how she had ever allowed herself to behave so clumsily. But at that moment, Eric smiled and said that she shouldn't have thanked him. And after that, he stepped back again. He said that he was already completely ready. All he had to do was put on his coat and asked if she could wait a little longer for him so that they could go together. The girl did not object, but thought to herself that this whole situation was too awkward. And besides, she was a little alarmed by the fact that Eric was already taking care of her and not the other way around. She had a very strange feeling, but the girl did not dwell on it too much because the guy was already ready and they went about their business. When they entered the separate building of the publication, Karen said that he had already been working under her supervision for several years. When she first brought him, he was still a very small boy who didn't know anything. Eric did not object. He said that at that time it was really true. He still needed to learn and understand a lot at that time. Karen was a little worried because Eric had already become an adult, which meant that there was very little time left until the day he would become king. He really grew up and became an incredibly handsome young man. Therefore, sometimes she could even stare at him, because even as a child he was already beautiful. Someone suddenly approached Karen, one of her assistants. The girl immediately looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened, because he looked a little worried. The man explained that they had a problem with budget processing and asked if she could come over and see if they could solve the problem. Karen, of course, did not object and went after him. She began to examine the papers that the assistant brought her in order to carefully double-check everything. As soon as she saw this problem that they were facing, she looked skeptically at the assistant and asked if he really couldn't solve all this without her. The man didn't even know what to answer to this. He felt a little awkward because they really didn't know what the solution to this problem was. And at that moment, when Karen was about to answer something, Eric suddenly came up to her from behind and said that there was a similar incident last year. He explained that if you look at last year's documents classified like this, then this is a very easily solved problem. At that moment, the man even put his hand on Catherine's palm in order to move the papers closer to him. Because of this, the girl felt even more awkward, and she immediately wanted to remove her hand. But she acted quite politely and still handed over the solved papers to the assistant. The guy was a little surprised because he didn't think that she would really be able to handle everything so quickly. At the same time, Eric took Catherine by the shoulders and began to lead her away, telling his teacher that they had decided everything so there was no need to linger any longer. The girl, meanwhile, yelled at her assistant and said that like the nut, and said in the future it would be better for him to conduct a proper study of the data before bringing it to her and wasting time. After that, she turned to her student and thanked him directly for his advice. However, it was still very rude of him to interrupt. Eric suddenly made a very guilty expression on his face and asked the girl for forgiveness. He said that it was too simple a problem and he was upset that she had to be distracted by such trifles. After that, they walked in silence for some time. And then suddenly the guy stopped abruptly in the middle of the road, turned to the teacher and asked, "Is she really not interested in the opposite sex?" Karen was incredibly surprised to hear this question and immediately asked why he suddenly asked such a thing. My man explained that during the entire time she was with him, he had never seen her dating anyone, so he decided to clarify. Karen thought about his question and then said that she thought that spending time on a date was a waste of time, so she was wasting her time on it. Then suddenly she smiled awkwardly and said that, besides everything, most likely no one would want to be so ugly with her. Eric, hearing this phrase, was so shocked that he couldn't even hide the surprise on his face. He immediately asked the girl what she meant. The teacher explained that she never received attention from the opposite sex, unlike her younger sister. Eric was about to tell the teacher that she was still incredibly beautiful, but the girl interrupted him and said that she liked spending time with him the most like this, so she didn't complain at all. The guy hearing this even became a little embarrassed. He was pleased to hear that she valued the time spent together. Then they went further, and in a quiet voice he told the teacher that she was very beautiful. Karen, hearing this, was surprised and immediately asked him not to praise her because it wouldn't work. She said that it would be best for them to go to work and not waste time on all this nonsense. The guy did not object, so they went to the office. Several hours had passed since they had entered the office, and now Karen had finally finished doing everything before the sun had even set. Eric, who worked with her in the same department, immediately smiled and said that he also graduated in this place, so they were both great. After that, he said that since they had not finished work earlier, they still had some free time. Therefore, he suggested that they go to the square. Karen replied that it would not be bad at all, since she had not been there for a long time. When Eric smiled and replied that he would start getting ready right away, but at that moment one of the Countess's assistants was walking into their office. He apologized for disturbing her, but said that the matter was urgent. The man replied that the queen had called her, so she needed to come immediately. Karen, hearing about this, was very surprised because this had never happened before. But of course, she immediately went to meet her, and she took Eric with her, and they came to the dining room to eat with the queen. So Nutty spoke first. She said that she heard that the guy had adapted well to life in the capital. While the guy and the queen were having a conversation, Karen kept thinking about why the woman suddenly decided to call her, because it was completely atypical. Well, then suddenly Sonetti said, "Since you have mastered etiquette, maybe you will gradually begin to live in the palace." She also explained that there are rumors that a romance has begun between her young cousin and the elderly countess, so perhaps this would help dispel all these rumors a little. Karen, hearing this news, even choked on her food. She wondered if anyone could really even think that she could have any feelings for Eric, and that they could have an affair. She immediately screamed loudly and said that they were just a teacher and a student. So of course this was completely unacceptable. But at that moment the queen suddenly laughed and said that she knew very well about the countess's innocence, and her reaction always amused her. Karen didn't understand whether she should take this as a compliment or not, but she didn't say anything else, and after a short silence, Sunit replied that the girl shouldn't forget why she brought the crown duke, says the place. And at that moment the girl finally began to guess what else was the reason why the queen decided to call them on that day so suddenly. She said that according to the original plan, she was going to make the crown duke a prince. As soon as Eric heard about this, he was sincerely amazed because no one had told him anything about this yet. He immediately turned to the queen and asked what this meant, because he had expected something completely different. But then suddenly Karen got ahead of him and told the queen that she understood everything. She also added that she would prepare him for his departure to the palace in the near future, so she shouldn't worry. Sonetti smiled happily and said that she was counting on the girl, so she was glad that she had everything prepared and taken care of. Eric couldn't believe at all that he had really been set up like that by the rest of the dinner party. He sat in complete silence. The guy couldn't utter a dry word because he didn't even know how one could talk calmly after such news. When it was all over and they left, Karen sighed heavily and said that she had eaten so little because of such unexpected news that now even her stomach was growling. She also said that she didn't think the queen would say it first and suggested that Sonetti knew that Karen hadn't had time to tell him yet. Eric then asked in a very sad and quiet voice, "Does this really mean that everything has already been decided and nothing can be changed?" Karina didn't answer anything. But then he turned to the teacher and asked why she didn't tell him in advance about such an important matter. Because he thought that they were in an honest relationship with each other. He was really very offended. He asked, "Was it really because I was just following orders that my opinion no longer mattered?" Karen was incredibly surprised to hear his words. She couldn't even imagine that he could feel that way, so the girl, for complete accuracy, asked again what all this meant. The man said that he suddenly became the crown prince and asked if she really thought that he didn't even need to explain how this could happen and Most importantly, why? Eric looked away from her and asked what she would do. If he said that he didn't want to be king, he assumed that she would probably find a new man and make him her apprentice. It was incredibly difficult and painful for him to realize the fact that for his teacher, the queen's order was much more important than his feelings. Karen was sincerely surprised to hear all this and immediately said that this was not at all the case. However, then she remembered the queen's words and what the girl had done in general, and she immediately felt very ashamed because she could not tell him that it was all untrue. Then Karen desperately tried to maintain her position. If Eric had not met the standards, then she would have already found someone else a long time ago. Eric replied that he thought the teacher had chosen him because he was responsible. However, this was just his delusion, as the whole situation now showed. He turned away from the girl and said that he now understood that she simply needed someone who could become the crown prince. Karen suddenly screamed and told Eric that perhaps it was like that at first, but now everything was completely different. But the guy wasn't going to listen to anything. He said that she didn't need to console him. He already understood what kind of person he was in her eyes. At that moment, Karen again saw memories from her past, namely when the whole world turned away from her. No one wanted to listen to her hypotheses and assumptions. No one wanted to accept the work she had done. Eric had already turned away and started walking towards the exit of the castle. He said that they were going to the square because she was hungry after this meeting with the queen. Karen still couldn't answer him anything, so they just silently went to the square. She hoped that at least there his mood would improve a little and they would be able to calmly discuss everything. When she approached the fountain, she said with a smile on her face that the weather was really good. So the girl was happy that they went out for a walk after all. After that, she thought about what she needed to eat. However, she could not even stand calmly because next to her was an incredibly upset Eric, in front of whom she was very ashamed. She could no longer pretend to be happy because she had no idea that Eric could think that way about her. Yes, and she also plunged into old memories in vain. Because of this, she couldn't even say anything to him normally, and accordingly, he remained with his thoughts, and she couldn't explain it to him properly. Then suddenly Karen noticed a small stall with cotton candy and she immediately wanted it, thinking that sugar could lift her spirits. The girl signed up to the seller and asked him to give her one cotton candy. Eric, who continued to stay behind her, was very surprised that she decided to choose this particular dessert. At that moment, he himself had a memory from the past when they first started working together. Karen took him to the market and gave him a piece of cotton candy to try. The boy, who had not left his castle all this time, was amazed that this cloudy thing could even be eaten. It seemed to him that it was something magical. Well, Karen laughed happily and replied that it wasn't a cloud but cotton candy, so she simply asked him to eat it. He was definitely going to like it. The boy finally took the courage and tried this thing. Karen immediately asked him if he liked it, and he smiled happily and said that it was sweet and interesting. After that, she stroked his head again and said that he should remember this sweetness well and compare it with other tastes. This way, he could find out what exactly he liked and what he didn't, and, accordingly, eat what he liked. It was a pretty nice moment from the past. However, even it made me happy, because now he was holding a huge cotton candy, but he still couldn't even look the girl in the eyes. Karen at the same time understood that things were difficult because in childhood, he loved her very much. However, now he did not look happy at all, and accordingly she hurt him very much. She kept remembering those words he said in the castle and realized that this whole situation could not have happened just like that. So they went towards the park, and Karen suggested that they talk a little in a calm atmosphere, because it was believed that they really had to figure out and discuss this whole situation. When they sat down on the bench, there was an awkward silence between them for some time. The girl did not know where to start this unpleasant conversation. But soon, she looked at Eric and said that a suitable person was needed for the post of crown prince, so she brought him to this place. The guy sighed heavily and replied that he understood it perfectly well. Now everything was fine. Thanks to this, he was able to meet with the teacher after all. But then suddenly Karen interrupted him and said that he was her choice. When she first saw him, she felt as if she saw her old self. In a child who did not know parental love and was abandoned, he desperately tried to survive at any cost. She saw something similar in Eric and compared it to her own life. The girl smiled and told the guy that her younger sister was a really beautiful child. Wherever the girl went, she always monopolized everyone's love and attention. But with Karen, the situation was completely opposite. So the girl studied very hard from an early age. She hoped that if she became smarter, her parents would at least once pay attention to her and perhaps even praise her for her work. But as if mocking all her efforts, Her sister even bred the quality of the saint, and thus came out on top again. Karen's achievements were completely meaningless in front of the miracle that appeared for the first time in hundreds of years. And on top of that, she was also scolded for the fact that Karen should have lived for her sister and not tried to develop her ambitions and achieve something on her own. She should always have helped only her sister. They always told her that she had to live for Carl and did not understand how she could be such a useless older sister. Her parents always blamed her for having her own dreams and ambitions. Karen, of course, would have started to think the same way because she was told this every time. But fortunately, this did not happen. After all, she had a teacher who led her on the right path. Teacher von Neumann allowed her to show her talents. He was the only one who noticed her talents from childhood, and the fact that the girl was now alive was also only thanks to the teacher. That is why Karen confessed to Eric that she also wanted to be such a teacher for him. She wanted to be the person who would see his value in this world and guide him on the right path so that he would not miss his chances for the best life. The guy didn't answer anything to this, and so after Karen finished speaking, they sat in complete silence for a while, each trying to understand what they had just heard. The girl thought about the fact that every time she only assessed Eric, but never thought about what kind of teacher she herself was. And now she didn't know what to do if Eric became disappointed in her and completely abandoned the idea of becoming king. If that happened, then she would really have nowhere to go, and she would be left with absolutely nothing. But then suddenly, the guy finally spoke, and in a trembling voice he told the girl that she was exactly that kind of teacher for him. After that, he put his hand on hers and said, looking straight into her eyes, that he too, thanks to her, came out into the world, and these 4 years were truly happy for him. If it weren't for her, he wouldn't even know the sweetness of cotton candy. Karen, hearing these words, was sincerely amazed. It was very valuable for her to hear this. The girl even became a little emotional, and she quickly wiped away the tears that began to flow onto her face. She thanked him for these words, and then said that perhaps at some point she simply took a wrong turn. Clearing her throat so that her voice would not shake, she said that her original goal was to raise him as a king. However, as he got older, everything changed. Over time, she began to think of him more than just as a student, but as her real family, which she never really had. That's why she asked the guy for forgiveness for not telling him earlier, but in his place she would also have been surprised and upset when she heard such fateful information from a complete stranger. Then, Karen took his hand and said that she actually still wanted him to become king, but if it was too hard for him, then of course he could refuse and not do it. She added, smiling, that she would certainly be proud of any choice he made, because the decisions he makes independently are the most correct ones for him. Eric thought about her words for a while. He didn't even answer. His face continued to be quite serious. Of course, she was very worried about this because, despite the fact that she said so, the girl knew that if he did not become king, then it would be the end for her. Then Eric finally spoke up and said that what the girl had told him before was still very much to him. But Karen believed that even if she had many mouths, it was not something that could be communicated so easily. Eric understood everything, so he smiled and said that it would be good if she did not have secrets from him in the future because it was really very unpleasant. The girl said that she would remember this request. Then the guy suddenly stayed in his place and said that since she believed in him so much, he was not going to disappoint her. Then Karen realized that now the end of the world would not come for her because he essentially agreed to become king. And this meant that her mission had not failed. That same evening, Eric went to the queen and said that there were still more than 2 weeks left before leaving for the palace, and he asked if there was a reason why the woman decided to call him so early. Sonetti smiled and said that she was just a little curious about one thing, so she called these guys to double-check. The girl asked if he really didn't know that he was supposed to become the future crown prince. As soon as the guy heard this question, he was very surprised because he didn't think that she called him precisely because of this. In fact, even when he was very little, Eric often asked his teacher if he could ever become as great a person as she was. He really didn't want to disappoint people, but even then he understood that he couldn't cope alone, so he needed those who would help him in those matters in which he couldn't. Karen then smiled and replied that it was like that. At such moments, it was important for everyone to look at the people who were next to him. For example, the girl pointed to herself and said that people like her who support the queen are very important and he could definitely rely on them. Eric was surprised by the words she said, and with hope in his voice, he asked if this really meant that she would be able to stay with him further. Smiling, the girl then answered him that nothing is impossible, but the ruler is sure that Wellington will find it a little difficult to accomplish. Eric, smiling happily, turned to the queen, answering her questions and said that she had overestimated him too much. Although he didn't know about the position of the crown prince, he knew that he wouldn't be able to take the position of the head of the queen's family. Upon hearing this, she immediately became interested and her gaze suddenly became very serious. Then the woman realized that Karen had made the right choice, but it would still be better if the king had a strong desire to become and take this position. Therefore, she would really like to see what kind of king this guy, who in some moments was quite soft, was supposed to become. How the peaceful days passed and eventually came to an end. The palace was in full swing, preparing for a banquet in honor of Eric's birthday and his move. They even discussed declaring it a national holiday, but Karen's aides believed that he was not the queen's biological son, so that might even be too much. But another assistant said that Her Majesty had no children, so he was rightfully first in line to the throne, so they had a very difficult situation with how they should proceed in all this. Karen, who was filling out important papers at the same time, did not understand. Were they really just talking? She was very irritated by the fact that they could not just let go of this situation and finally choose something. The girl, who had already filled out some papers, began to hold them out to the side out of habit and give them to Eric. But he was not there at that moment, so there was no one to give them to. The other workers, seeing this, immediately began to whisper among themselves. One of them said that the director was also a human being. She did not want to let her precious student go, so they assumed that this trip was also difficult for her. Karen, having heard all this perfectly, immediately shouted loudly at them and asked if they really had nothing better to do. The men, having gone out the door, answered that they were very busy. Therefore, they decided not to irritate her anymore. In fact, all these years Karen had been carrying Eric around and making him work, so now she felt a little awkward about it all. Despite the fact that she was really very sad because he was leaving, but these 4 years were precisely for this moment. She knew what she was going for and what outcome should await her. She was absolutely sure that Eric would become a good king and she would simply leave. He would no longer rely on her, because he would be able to take responsibility for everything himself. The girl thought that if the newly minted king had his mentor next to him, this would definitely cause various gossip. So, leaving Eric, the girl will be able to do her research again, inhaling the smell of books. So she decided not to be too upset about this, because that case was still her favorite. But in order for this time to finally come, Karen needed to stop flying in the clouds and do all the work. After all, there was little time left before the banquet, and she had to close all the necessary questions. Some time passed since then. Late at night, Karen finally returned home. She was very tired, and the first thing she was going to do was go to Eric. But there the first thing she met was the maid Maria. She greeted the countess. The girl, seeing her in this place, was a little surprised. She was even worried. She asked why Maria was in Eric's room, and then, looking around, she noticed that it was too empty, and asked what happened to the room in that case. The maid immediately explained that the young master had already moved to the palace. Karen stopped abruptly at that moment. She could not believe that this was really true. The girl asked if he really did it so soon. After all, this move was supposed to be next week. The maid, who was still a little worried, replied that she herself didn't really know anything. The young master was in a hurry, so she didn't even have time to ask him about anything. Karen was amazed. She even felt some disappointment in all this because she hoped that he would at least say goodbye to her before leaving. Maria, who noticed her strange expression, immediately said that if the girl was uneasy, then perhaps it would be best to write him a letter and find out all the details that way. The girl was a little surprised when she heard about the letter, but Maria explained that the young gentleman had gone into an unfamiliar environment, so he probably hadn't fully settled in yet. The maid told her that if the countess sent him a letter, it would definitely be able to support him in difficult times, and he would be very grateful to her for it. Karen seriously thought about her words and then realized that she was really right when he moved into the townhouse in Monderol. He was tormented by nightmares every night. And besides, she taught him how to write letters and even received letters from him for practice. It was very sweet and pleasant, but she herself had never written him any letter, so Karen decided that perhaps he might really be happy if he received it. Maria immediately said that this would definitely be the case. Then she ran into another room saying that they would prepare paper and a pen. The woman also said that there was another gift that the young gentleman had prepared for her before his departure, so she was going to bring that one as well. And so, when several weeks had passed since that moment, Eric's birthday arrived, and it was also the day of celebrating the move to the palace. The banquet hall was filled with a variety of aristocrats and guests. It was truly a very large banquet. Also, all the people were delighted with how exactly the Queen of Sinetti tried to do this event. But it was not surprising because he was her only relative. There were also many rare dishes for the Orchian in that place. However, at that moment, while all the people were discussing the situation and everything like that, another person suddenly entered the hall. This girl turned out to be Countess Monroe. The girl was dressed in a beautiful tight white dress. She looked simply amazing that evening. Karen gathered all the eyes that were fixed on her. Some even thought that all this was done intentionally in order to show that she was his guardian, and so that everyone would begin to admire her even more. The girl herself tried to draw attention to these provocations. She could not believe that the gift that Maria was talking about was this dress that Eric asked to wear to the ceremony. But then suddenly everyone around became quiet because the butler began to introduce Her Majesty Queen Sonnet, who had just appeared in the hall. She arrived with the Crown Duke Eric, and the people around immediately began to look in their direction and loudly applaud in order to show their respect and joy. Karen also decided to come closer to look at them. She was happy that it happened just in time, and all these terrible rumors finally stopped. The doors to the banquet hall opened and a truly beautiful Queen of Sonnetti walked in, wearing a long black dress, and Eric walked next to her in a suit of the same color. They looked perfect together. When they passed by the aristocrats, they immediately bowed and greeted them. Karen did the same. She only raised her gaze briefly to see what Eric was wearing, and noticed that he even wore the brooch that she had given him a long time ago. She bought this brooch because she thought it would look good with Eric's outfit, and so she was very happy that she sent it with the letter because it arrived just in time. At the same time, when the man was walking past all the guests, he noticed Karen, and noticed that she had put on that dress after all. He was even about to smile, but then the queen suddenly addressed him in a stern voice and told him to watch his facial expression. The man didn't quite understand why such a remark was made to him. However, she said that he would of course try to keep an eye on him. After this, Eric looked around again to see what kind of guests had come this time, and he noticed some young lady standing in the crowd. However, this woman looked at him without stopping. She stood with her head raised and a frightening smile on her face. The queen also noticed that they exchanged glances, and at some point she thought that perhaps she should intervene and sort this matter out. But then the girl thought that the king had to deal with something like this, so she didn't even pay attention to it. It is quite obvious that a king who cannot cope with one subject is nonsense, so she had to observe how a man would behave in such situations. As soon as they approached the throne, the girl took her place and Eric stood next to her. The woman then addressed those present in a serious and disciplined voice and told them to raise their heads. After she saw the looks on people's faces, the woman thanked everyone who came to celebrate her nephew Eric's birthday. However, before they began the banquet, she wanted to say something else. She had no heirs, and she thought for a long time about this serious problem in her life. Karen. As soon as she heard this, she was now calm. Because in fact, the queen had not announced this information until this moment, so people could only guess. But the queen said that this was precisely why she decided to accept the crown prince, Eric, as her adopted son and declared him the crown prince of this country. When the man heard this, he was very shocked and immediately turned to her in a whisper and asked why she started talking about her adopted son, since they had not talked about this. But the woman ignored his words and addressed the people and said that from now on, they had to call him Crown Prince Eric and accordingly showed due respect to his status. After that, she took his hand and took off the ring and put it on his finger. In fact, putting on the ring meant recognizing him as the heir to the entire fortune, and so now Eric was truly the future king. As soon as people saw and heard all this, they immediately began to joyfully applaud and shout praise. Karen, who was standing behind them, was really proud of this man. She thought that he had grown significantly during this time, and she was pleased to see what successes he had finally begun to achieve. Now that Eric's appointment as prince had become official, her work had also come to an end. And in fact, it was already time to leave, so the girl was already about to turn around and slowly walk towards the exit of the banquet hall. But at that moment, she suddenly saw that someone approached her. Raising his head up, she saw that it was indeed Erich. He happily smiled and greeted the teacher. The girl was very surprised at the time. She didn't understand when he even managed to come up to her. But the guy asked if she could do him the honor of dancing with him. Karen was very surprised by such a proposal, but she eventually agreed, thinking that it could not hurt much. As soon as they came out to the middle of the hall and began their dance, the women who were very envious of the Bob began, of course, to discuss it. They couldn't believe that she actually took his first dance. They were very sad. But in the end, they realized that she was his teacher, so they had nothing to do. While they were dancing, Karen turned to Eric because she wanted to talk to him about something else. The girl asked, "Don't you know how important the first dance is in high society?" The man immediately said that of course he knew this and didn't understand why she was asking such a stupid question. But Karen then asked why he decided to invite her in that case. Eric replied that he knew all this, and that was the reason he decided to invite her. Then he moved closer to her and whispered in her ear that he had received the brooch from her after all. He asked how she was able to pick such a beautiful brooch that perfectly matched his outfit. Karen moved him a little further away from her because he was too close and said that she had been watching him for so many years, so it was obvious that she knew his preference in clothes. He immediately smiled happily and said that it was indeed true. They continued dancing for some time in silence, and Karen thought about the fact that he had really grown into a rather handsome young man. And that same girl who was watching Eric the most during the beginning of the ceremony began to follow him this time. The black-haired young lady in the purple dress thought that she really liked him after all. And so she was going to tame this precious prince to her feet and twist him around her fingertips. However, the woman with whom Eric was now dancing was incredibly irritating to this girl, and she did not know what to do. After their dance ended, Karen smiled happily and congratulated him on his birthday. After all, she had never done this before. The man was really pleased that she did this, but he also asked that she be sure to congratulate him next year. Karen seriously thought about whether she would be able to fulfill his request, because next year she would most likely no longer be with Eric. But in order not to upset him, she said that, of course, she would do it. After that, the girl turned around and started to leave. And the guy just stood in the middle of the banquet hall for a while because he was a little sad. He thought about something. However, he was interrupted from his thoughts by a female voice that came from behind. This woman turned to the prince and said that she was incredibly glad to meet him. Eric was a little surprised because he didn't know who it could be, so he turned around to see who was talking to him. As soon as he turned around, he saw the dark-haired young lady who was watching him. She bowed and said that her rank was Janet from the Marquisate of Pax, and asked if he could dance with her. Of course, Eric immediately recognized this woman. She was standing in the crowd and smiling at him very strangely. Because of this, he was going to act with her rather carefully. In fact, he remembered that she was the only daughter of the Marquis of Pax, one of the families of those aristocrats who had great influence in the aristocratic council. He assumed that there would be no great harm if they became friends, so he joyfully extended his hand forward and said that of course he wouldn't mind if they danced. Janet then smiled happily and thought that, up close, he was even more handsome than from afar, and she was also happy that he decided not to refuse her. After the music started playing again, they started dancing. Karen, meanwhile, started walking through the crowd and only glanced back briefly. The girl saw that Eric's next dance partner was Lady Janet from the Pax Marquis. Considering her background, it was a pretty good choice. However, for some reason, Karen had a strange feeling that she couldn't understand for some time. She supposed that perhaps it was so strange because it was the first time she saw a man with a girl of her own age. But as soon as she looked at Eric, she also noticed that he began to simply glow with happiness. Because of this, Karen became even sadder. For a while, she just watched them dance, but then she felt really bad, so she decided to leave the hall after all. The music continued to play, and they continued to dance. When Eric turned around, he noticed that his teacher had already decided to leave. Janet, of course, noticed his questioning look and decided to talk about this very topic. She asked, "Were they really that close with Countess Monderol?" The man explained that she was his teacher who taught him a lot. However, suddenly the girl interrupted him and said that, however, all this was unimportant. In a rather rude and ignorant voice, she simply said, "Ladinka is an old and unpopular woman without any political support." That is how she saw his teacher. As soon as Eric heard these words, he immediately became angry and asked the lady not to dare insult his teacher, otherwise the consequences for her would be dire. But the girl asked if in their time stating a fact was already an insult. But Eric stopped their dance. He pushed the girl away from him and told her to stop doing that, because it was ignorant and unpleasant. But Janet suddenly began to smile and said that he became even sweeter when he was offended. She came closer to the man again and said that she had also heard about him. Some say that he had a rather unhappy childhood. Janet grabbed him by his clothes and began to move him closer to her. She closed her eyes and reached for his lips in order to kiss the man. Eric was so shocked by this unexpected action that at first he didn't even know what to do. Then he shouted loudly at her, asking what she was doing at the same time. He tried to push the girl away from him, but Janet smiled happily and lowered herself a little lower, leaving a kiss with a trace of her lipstick on his collar. She still didn't kiss him on the lips, but moved closer to his ear and asked in a gentle voice if he would like to start dating her. She said that, with her influence and wealth, he would no longer be afraid of anything in this world. Eric did not even intend to listen to her to the end. He immediately said that of course he refused this. But Janet had already achieved her goal, so she said that he would still regret his decision. The man was not going to listen to her. She was very unpleasant to him. For this reason, he simply turned around and started to walk away, leaving her alone in the middle of the ballroom. Well, the girl wasn't upset at all. She just smiled happily and thought that her plan had gone according to plan. And she had never missed out on something she wanted to get, and this time everything went just perfectly. Everyone in the empire knew that the main branch of Russian industry was livestock farming, and those people who owned vast meadows enjoyed great wealth. Among them was also the Pax family, and they were one of the most such families. And the only daughter of the Marquis of Pax was Janet. Because she was also the only heir to this huge fortune, the girl bathed in the attention of men, and each of these men courted her precisely because of her origin. But the men who came easily to her could not arouse any interest in her at all. However, this man who was the crown prince was a completely different story and case for her. He had nothing but good looks. However, what an arrogant character he had, according to Janet, and that is why she wanted to get this man at any cost. She was interested in whether the man would come to her on his own if she took something valuable from him. Since the man did not agree to cooperate with her in a good way, she decided to appoint his teacher as her first target, since he had the closest relationship with her. Meanwhile, Karen had returned home. She had already changed from the dress into her usual clothes and was happy to find herself in a quiet, calm room. The girl sat down at her bedside table and began to stretch her legs. She had absolutely no idea how everyone managed to dance in such terrible, uncomfortable shoes. She came to the conclusion for herself that the most ordinary shoes were the best for her. Then the girl suddenly turned her head to the side and saw that there was a letter on the table. She was a little surprised because this letter was somehow especially tattered, so she decided to read it first, even though she was quite tired. The girl opened the envelope and noticed that it was a letter from another country, and as soon as she read it, her heart started beating faster and her hands started shaking. She couldn't believe that all this was really serious. This letter was sent from Karen's sister, namely Carla. The woman wrote that they had not seen her for a long time, and since her sister did not answer her, this letter would be the last. And in it, Carla wrote that she would soon arrive in the region. So she hoped that her sister would meet her. Karen couldn't believe what she read. She even broke into a sweat. She was horrified. In fact, Carla was always the one who made the girl feel completely insignificant in this world. Since childhood, the girl was very trusting. One day, a stranger handed her a candy. Of course, Karen yelled at her and said that she had said that strangers could be very dangerous, so it was impossible to contact them. But Carla was always naughty. She then told her sister that it was me. The stranger was the one who gave her the lollipop last time. Seeing the surprised expression on her sister's face, she said that she didn't get a lollipop either because she looked at this world with an angry expression on her face. Carlos said that her little sister was always like that, and if she had a kind heart, she would also receive the same delicious lollipops. But as it was, she was forced to only grieve. Her sister was a girl who charmed people with her brilliance, which, unfortunately, Karen did not have. This shine that turned her into a lump of inferiority complex was the most hateful thing for the girl even in adulthood. So when she found out that her sister was supposed to come, she could not come to terms with this news for some time. Even the next day when Karen went to work, she couldn't stop thinking about it. A shocked assistant came to her and said that they had ordered her from above to double-check these documents and sign them. But the girl simply told him in an angry voice to leave them on the table and leave. The man had absolutely no idea what had happened to their boss that day. However, he decided not to anger her even more because she looked even worse than she had when she spoke to them. Karen was so upset by her sister's arrival that even old memories began to pop up in her head. And it was just terrible, because she did everything to forget them. The girl thought about what if Carla left as she wrote in the letter. She had less than 6 months left. It was so long ago. But the girl still felt as if she had returned to childhood. Karen decided that the best thing for her to do was to just focus on work in order to distract herself from these obsessive thoughts. She was going to start on the documents she had been asked to check as soon as possible, and as soon as she picked up one of these papers, she was pleasantly surprised. After all, it spoke about some kind of hunting festival. At this very time, Eric was next to the queen because they had a weekly reception of the townspeople who had their requests, wishes, and complaints. A dark-haired old man came to them and he said that he wanted them to hold the hunting festival again this year. He thought it was incredibly important for them. Eric assumed that he probably really wanted to boast about the power of his family, and it was for this reason that he proposed holding this holiday again. The man approached a resident of the city and said that this was an event that the previous king, Marquis Pax, had cancelled, so he did not understand why he had to bring it back. The men explained that the royal family had had too few events lately, and for the crown prince, it would also be a very good opportunity to strengthen ties with other aristocrats. So it was beneficial for everyone. Eric was about to object, but the queen interrupted him and said with a smile on her face that she was also a parent and she would like to show off the skills of her dear prince. She stood up from her seat and said that when she interferes in all this, it looks like she's getting involved in children's quarrels, so she has refrained from commenting on all sorts of things until now. But this time, the girl explained her actions by the fact that she was so interested in what kind of magnificent booty the crown prince could bring back, so she was all for this event. So she assured this townsman that they would definitely hold a hunting festival this year, so he didn't have to worry. Of course, Eric was not at all happy to hear this, unlike the man who proposed this idea. He bowed, thanked Her Highness for permission, and left. When they were alone, the guy turned to the queen and said that he was against it, but the girl was surprised by his sharp reaction and asked why he was so against it. Wasn't he good at horse riding and fencing? But Eric explained that this was not the point at all. At the big event, which the queen would not be leading, there would certainly be those who would try to catch him in shortcomings, but he didn't want to give them such an opportunity at such a big event. After all, they had already had enough time to gossip about him. The girl then asked in a rough voice, "Did Karen really teach you that the monarch should be perfect?" The guy said that it was not so. She emphasized that the monarch does not need to do everything himself. Sonetti smiled and said that she had trained him well, because a monarch is someone who asserts his authority. Authority is fear caused by cruelty, or one could gain conditional loyalty through benefit. Of course, the guy had neither a cruel disposition nor anything in his hands. So now it will be incredibly difficult for him to somehow establish his authority among people. However, there was a way to keep in check those he didn't like, and smiling, the queen asked him what exactly that way was. The man immediately said that it was probably the fact that he was the crown prince. Then Sonetti replied that everything was exactly like that. She said that his very existence was already important because she personally adopted him, so he had to use the hunting festival to show off his beautiful, flower-like appearance. Eric didn't like this at all. However, he had no choice because the queen said so and he had to act like that. Sonetti smiled happily and said that apparently Karen had taught him well. However, Karen was a hopeless straight-A student, so she was very weak in non-standard situations. She simply panicked and did not know how to get out of such situations. She explained to the guy that if he only did what Karen taught him, he definitely wouldn't be able to last long because not everything in the world happened according to the rules. Eric, rising from his seat, thanked the queen for her advice and said that the audience was already over so he would like to leave it. The woman did not object and said that he could go, after which the guy walked past her and left. At the same time, another man came to her who wanted to talk to the queen. The young man who was a knight bowed and asked for forgiveness from Her Majesty and said that he already had something to report. The queen said that she already knew, so she asked him not to delay but to report the information. The woman who appeared to the parents said that a murderer had broken into the residence of Countess Mandarole. Everything went as she had expected. As soon as the queen heard this, she said that it was very good. But for some time, the countess needed to be carefully guarded. The knight said that she understood everything and would definitely fulfill this request. Sonetti herself thought that it would not be difficult to prevent them from acting according to a predictable scenario. However, she would not be able to protect him forever. Therefore, the girl thought that he, namely Eric, needed to quickly understand everything and finally deal with this issue on his own. That same evening, Janice was furious because she heard the news that her plan had unfortunately failed, and she even threw a cup at her assistant. The girl screamed loudly and said, "How much money I spend on you, but you can't even kill one girl." Her assistant bowed and said that the security turned out to be much stronger than they thought, so they were simply powerless in this case. Jenny, upon hearing this, immediately asked what kind of nonsense this was. They said they didn't have a private army in their house and they weren't even real aristocrats, so this was definitely impossible. The man explained that they themselves were actually very surprised by this, and he also asked if it would not be best to get rid of her at the Lion Palace. The girl heard this and became even more angry. She asked, did he really think that the Queen of Sonetti was such an idiot that she would not understand anything at all? She also said that they are insignificant and have never met her personally, so they can say that. But in fact, the Queen is a real deity who knows everything. In fact, when Jenny was still very little, she met this queen and said that she was very flattered that she already knew her name in advance. However, when the queen looked at this girl with her magical gaze, she immediately understood what her intentions were and what she was like. That's why Sonetti told Tanya to smile falsely and asked, "Do you really think that I will look at your appearance and fall in love with your rotten nature?" The girl was, of course, very surprised. She did not expect that the queen would be able to find out her intentions so much, so after bowing, she simply bowed and left, no longer wanting to even be near this woman. Since then, she felt uncomfortable meeting this queen, so Jen answered that she needed a place where she could do business and escape the gaze of this lady. Then she asked if it was true what her father had mentioned, that they would hold a hunting festival this time. And when the knight said that it was indeed so, she was very happy, because this festival was a great idea. She asked her assistant if he knew what would happen if they failed this time. The man immediately said that they would not allow this to happen again, and she simply kicked him out. After all, he irritated her very much. When Janice was left alone, she was incredibly happy because she was already in anticipation. The girl believed that the new plan that she had come up with was simply ideal. Therefore, she could not wait to bring it to reality. She was really looking forward to the moment when Eric would belong to her, and she would be able to do absolutely whatever she wanted with him. And finally, after some time, the day of the hunting festival arrived. Many different people came there, and many of them wanted to show their abilities. Eric, who opened this festival, stood on the podium in front of all the warriors of the Rayhan of the country that should never fall. He began his speech and said that the time had come to test our virtues of patience and courage, so he was ready to announce the beginning of the hunting festival. Karen, who was in the building at that moment and heard all this, was incredibly proud of her student. She thought that he was really cool and admired his courage. Then she turned to Her Highness, who was also in the room, and asked if the queen really did not intend to go to that festival. Wait. At that moment, she was wrapped in a very warm blanket and said that she was very cold, so she would not go, and Eric was doing so well. So she did not think that her presence was necessary at all. Karen thought that they were indoors, so she didn't understand how the girls were so cold. But the girls still felt uncomfortable, so she wasn't going to go anywhere. Therefore, the countess, leaving the room, told the queen to rest, and she would go and look at everything, because she was really interested in how exactly this festival was supposed to take place and what was special about it. But before she could go out the door, the queen turned to Karen and asked if it would not have been better to take a sword a little stronger and heavier than the one she had chosen for herself. The girl smiled and asked if the queen really thought that she, as a ruler, would look for enemies in everyone. However, suddenly Sinetti smiled and said that it was really true. She was so clumsy, and so it was better for her not to participate in all this because she could cut her own hand waving a sword. This is why Karen did not participate in outdoor events where force was necessarily required. But this time she was appointed as the manager, so she couldn't do anything about it. She really hoped that nothing would happen to it. So she went straight to the street. She came to the place where the hunting festival would take place for 3 days. It was the Highlands. This area was really incredibly amazing. There were many green trees around, and the grass was still very soft, and there were also several special tents prepared for the participants and spectators. In this tournament, the knight who brings the largest booty during this period becomes the winner. So many had to try hard. And the lady, wishing victory to the knight whom they support, ties a ribbon to the hilt of his sword. Thus, the number of ribbons became a measure of popularity. One knight could have many such ribbons on his handle. This helped motivate the fighters. Karen, the first thing she did after leaving the queen, immediately went to Eric. The girl officially addressed the prince. The man who was already preparing his horse was a little surprised. Turning back, he saw who exactly it was, and his eyes literally sparkled with joy and his cheeks turned red. The girl approached him, smiled happily, and said that he had just a great speech and she was now even very motivated. But the man smiled at her and replied that it was all only thanks to her. Karen thought that in addition to the fact that he was an incredibly handsome man, he also spoke beautifully, and accordingly, he already had many ribbons on his handle. She already wanted to say something else when suddenly they heard a female voice. It belonged to Jenny, who was approaching Eric. The girl held a pink ribbon in her hands, of course, to attach it to his weapon and thereby show that she also supported him. As soon as Jenny ran up to Eric, she said that he should accept her tape too. She was almost late while trying to cope with her embarrassment, but still plucked up the courage and came to him. At that moment, he immediately remembered the banquet in honor of his birthday and how she almost kissed him. Of course, he was still disgusted by that situation. So in an incredibly rude voice, she turned to Lady Pax and asked her not to come close. His voice sounded very distant and rude. But Janice tried to ignore all this, smiling happily. She said that he could just call her by name. It was not necessary to formally greet her. But the man said that he would like to refuse this offer. Then Jenny agreed with him and said that their bond is not so simple, so caution really would not hurt. Karen, who was standing nearby and watching this whole situation, noticed that Lady Pax was incredibly persistent, and they had just danced together. But the girl thought that since Eric had become a prince, it was quite natural. However, she did not understand why it was so painful for her to watch all this. Therefore, at some point, she even wanted to leave. While Janice was telling him something about the tape, he suddenly turned his attention to the teacher and noticed that something was wrong with it. The guy left the girl aside and went up to Karen and, taking her hand, asked if everything was okay with her. He noticed that she looked pretty bad and also asked if she was really unwell. But the girl replied that everything was fine with her, so he didn't have to worry. Janice, who stood to the side and watched all this, could not understand whether it was because of this nondescript woman who did not even have any title that he did not even want to look in her direction. This, of course, irritated her very much. Then she clearly decided for herself that she would definitely have to remove this girl, because she was the one who stood in her way in the first place. Jean looked back at one of the knights and nodded her head at him, thus letting him know that he could start their plan. Then the man quickly approached the prince and said that it would take quite a long time for all the royal knights to arrive and asked what he thought about climbing the mountain while they were still waiting. Eric, hearing that he wanted to climb the mountain, was a little surprised, but his assistant explained that he was probably very bored, so they could take a walk like that. How did he say that from there you can see simply a wonderful landscape? Eric then turned to his teacher and asked if she would like to go there with him and see these landscapes. The girl immediately said that, in fact, if he wanted it that way, then she was not even against it. At that moment, the assistant bowed and said that in that case, he would prepare it for departure. At that moment, Janice thought that she would definitely achieve success over time, and that even a man would not recognize her. Even she herself thought that this was the best love letter in the world that she had prepared for him, so the girl was already ready. At the same time, Eric was walking next to Karen. She noticed that something was wrong with him, so she immediately turned to him and asked if everything was okay. The guy replied that everything was fine, so he asked her not to pay attention and they were already leaving. Then they saddled their horses and set off. Karen noticed that it was a little cloudy around, but this upset her a little. However, the landscape still turned out to be quite beautiful. From a distance, this landscape looked like a gentle hill. But when they started to climb, it turned out to be a real mountain, which pleasantly surprised her. All this time they rode in silence, but Eric suddenly turned to the teacher and asked if she was tired. The girl replied that her horse was more tired than she was, and she could ride even further. Well then, the man replied that they would arrive very soon. Karen thought that it would be faster than she thought, because she had really expected a very long journey. And at that moment, a rather large drop of rain fell right on her face. She immediately asked if it was really starting to rain. Eric answered that they were almost there, and the drops were not so microbial, so there was no need to worry. He also asked if she would mind if they walked a little more and then came down. Karen thought about it and said that she probably wouldn't mind after all because she also didn't want to spend a lot of time on all this. Eric suddenly noticed that a strong wind had started blowing around, so he asked the teacher if she was by any chance cold. So he said that if she was cold, she could at least take his coat, but Karen immediately refused this and said that she was fine, so he didn't have to worry. Karen also said that she was still strengthening her position, so the guy shouldn't have shown her any preference. Therefore, even among subordinates, he had to behave with restraint, because even his warm care could be misinterpreted by the guy. Of course, the guy didn't like it at all, but he still agreed with her and didn't insist anymore. They continued on their way, and then, suddenly, they both noticed that they had come to an unusual place, namely, an incredibly beautiful lake. Karen, seeing it, immediately realized that this was the same lake that was formed after the eruption of lava, and it was really magnificent. So for some time, they simply enjoyed this view. Smiling, she said that it was incredible beauty, then turned to Eric and asked if he thought the same. Eric, who was looking directly at the girl, smiled happily and said that it was indeed a beauty. But Garen still did not understand that he was not talking about a beautiful view at all. But at that moment, one of the knights suddenly approached him and wanted to tell him something. The guy immediately stopped and in the meantime went further closer to the lake. When she approached the water, she saw her reflection in it, which was literally sparkling, and she assumed that perhaps it was because of the thunderstorms that the landscape became even more majestic for her. And at that moment, the girl didn't even suspect anything. However, an arrow whistled past her and flew straight towards the horse. Karen immediately screamed loudly from fear of the knights seeing that an attack had taken place. They gave the order to protect the prince, and Eric just sat in surprise and watched everything that was happening. He definitely did not expect this. And when his stupor ended, He immediately shouted loudly, addressing the teacher, whom the horse had at the same time thrown straight into that lake. Karen tried to get out of the water, but she didn't succeed. She also tried to understand what kind of attack had happened. The girl didn't know who did it and why. However, she had a more serious problem. She couldn't swim. And then, Corona suddenly saw that someone was approaching her. Taking a closer look, she realized that it was Eric, who dived after her in order to save her. The guy still managed to swim close enough to her to catch her. He immediately began to pull the girl to the surface so that she would not suffocate. And soon, they both found themselves at the top of the water. Karen began to spit out unnecessary particles of water while breathing heavily, and Eric continued to worry that something would happen to her. He held her by the shoulder and asked if everything was okay with him. For some time, the girl continued to cough, but soon she realized that she could not even stand on her feet, so her consciousness began to fly away from her. She stopped seeing Eric clearly. Quite a lot of time had passed since then, and Karen finally regained consciousness. Her eyes widened suddenly, thinking that she had still been underwater. However, this was not the case. She was already lying on the shore. Eric, seeing that she was finally conscious, smiled happily and asked if everything was okay with her. At that moment, the girl Sev touched her head, which hurt incredibly badly. The man asked her not to overexert herself because she briefly lost consciousness after falling into the water. Karen still looked worried. She asked where they were. The man explained that he had brought her to a cave in the mountains while the guards held off the attackers. They were able to escape safely. After this, Eric asked her for forgiveness for the fact that because of him, she found herself in such a difficult situation of feeding, and at the same time she thought about what exactly he meant when he said that it was because of him. She believed that the first arrow was definitely aimed at her. If their target was Eric, they would not have touched her. So she assumed that initially she was precisely their target. Karen immediately understood the reason why she had been put in charge of the festival. However, she now also realized the fact that it was because of her that Eric was in such grave danger. Eric saw her frightened expression and asked if he could ask her something. Karen, of course, said that of course he could ask about anything. The man explained that he was actually lucky to find his horse, which ran away in panic after the attack, and they galloped quite far, and therefore, in the process, Eric simply got lost in the area. He found this cave with difficulty and even made a fire, but he does not know how to get back because the area is completely incomprehensible to him. Karen, meanwhile, asked what happened with that chase, and the man explained that when they got to the cave, he sent the horse away. And since it was raining there, it would be very difficult for them to track them down, so everything had to be under control. When she heard about all this, she was able to breathe a sigh of relief because it could really help them. Eric replied that now they could only wait in this place for help. Then he noticed that she was shaking all over from the cold, because it was really cold outside because of the rain. He turned to the teacher and said that she needed to take off her wet clothes. Karen, hearing that he wanted her to undress, was very surprised and asked why she suddenly needed to do this. The man explained that because they were in the lake, their clothes were wet and their body temperature continued to drop. So he thought that the best thing to do, in order not to make things worse for himself, was to take them off. When the girl heard about what exactly he meant, that is, it immediately became easier. After that, she said that she really didn't mind taking off her clothes because it could help. She was already going to move in the other direction but didn't have time. And all because Eric didn't even turn away from her. He just quickly took off his shirt, and as soon as Karen saw his naked body, she was pleasantly surprised. But the girl was also very embarrassed. Eric, seeing her surprised expression, asked if there was really something wrong. Karen immediately screamed loudly and said that everything was fine. Then the man asked if she needed help to undress. The girl was even more surprised by this. She was incredibly surprised by such a proposal, but immediately said that she definitely did not need help. She would undress and come back, so she asked him to just wait there. And when some time had passed since that moment, they finally took off their outer clothing, which was incredibly wet, and also lit a fire. Eric, meanwhile, sat behind her and pressed the girl closer to himself in order to warm her with his body as well. They had never been so close before. This made Karen feel a little awkward. However, despite this, she actually felt a little warmer than she had before. Then, Eric turned to her and said that in fact there was a way to warm up even better. The girl, hearing about this, was a little surprised and immediately asked what this way was. Well, the man suddenly began to turn her closer to him. Karen was very surprised and immediately shouted loudly at him, asking what he was doing and, most importantly, why. But the guy explained that if you hug, it will be much warmer, so that's exactly what he wanted to do. But Karen yelled at him and said that she understood everything and was not against warming up even more. However, she did not like the way he looked at her. Karen said that she was too skinny, and she was doing something ugly, so she didn't want him to do that to her. Eric, hearing about this, was very angry. He suddenly pulled the girl towards him and said that this was not at all true. She was the most beautiful person he had ever seen. She was incredibly amazed. The girl herself, feeling his good deed on her own, now thought about what she had not noticed before. For example, she did not know that Eric always had such broad shoulders. Then Karen felt that something was starting to push into her. She immediately decided to tell the man about it, but Eric felt even more embarrassed and replied that they were hugging, so he couldn't do anything about it. Karen could barely contain her nervous laughter. She said that, in fact, she understood everything perfectly well, because he was a man after all, so she decided that she just needed to be patient. The girl also thought that this look was not because of her, it was a natural reaction. So she generally regretted that she had said anything to him. She just needed to pretend that she hadn't noticed anything. At that moment, the two of them felt incredibly awkward being so close to each other, but in order to dilute their atmosphere, Eric decided to turn to the girl. He asked Karen if she remembered the first time he stood in front of a crowd, confused. She told him that looking at him, he was beautiful and fine, like a sculpture. When the girl heard about this, she was very surprised because she had completely forgotten about it and asked if this really happened. The man replied that she had also said that he was not her type. When she heard about this, she was sincerely surprised because she had absolutely no recollection of saying such words, but in fact, she had changed too much since that moment and would definitely not say such things to a child now. But at that moment, Eric suddenly began to approach her closer and asked if he was her type now. The man continued to hold the girl by the waist so that she would not run away from him. Karen couldn't believe that he actually asked her something like that. And besides, they were too close for her to be able to think straight. But Eric repeated his question and wondered if he really wasn't her type now either. And the man was sweating because he was very worried. Karen immediately screamed loudly at him and asked what he was saying and, most importantly, why. But smiling, the man said that he was very curious and that is why he asked her such a question, hoping that she would be able to answer it. Karen then yelled loudly at him and asked why he even decided to ask her about this in such an already tense and awkward situation. But Eric continued to pull her closer to him and asked if she had ever thought about something like this while looking at him. He then pulled her even closer. Now their lips were a couple of centimeters apart. "You are a lesson from a friend." And Eric said that he was about whether she ever wanted a relationship that went beyond the framework of a student or family. In fact, she was so close to Eric that she even saw her reflection in his pupils. And because of this, she saw that her face turned incredibly red, which surprised the girl very much. She herself, meanwhile, was trying to understand whether Eric really had any feelings for her, and that was precisely why he began asking such questions. But she did not answer his question. Eric continued to insist on his own. He asked Karen to understand his feelings. After all, they were really true. And at that moment, when the guy was already about to kiss Karen, they heard some screams outside. A male voice said that he had finally found the right cave, so they were about to enter it. In the end, thanks to one of the guards who barely managed to escape and report the news, the guy and the girl were finally saved and they returned back to the palace. But to be more precise, it was because the queen had accurately indicated their location, and I had to stay in the cave for so long. When news of their disappearance reached the Sonetti queen, she said that they were most likely not in the shelter at the eastern-western foot of the mountain, so she asked that they be brought before it got too cold. And because of this, Karen suddenly had an unpleasant feeling, as if they were dancing to the queen's tune. But when they returned to the palace, the girl praised the prince and said that he had done a very good job. Eric then leaned towards her and wanted to return to their previous conversation. But the girl ran away from him and suggested talking about it next time, because now she was too tired. And it was incredibly awkward because of all this. Eric, meanwhile, remained standing and followed the girl with his gaze. He did not understand why she did not want to talk to him. However, he decided to respect her wishes, and when he was about to turn around and leave, a lady suddenly passed by him and angrily asked how this woman was able to return alive. Of course, the guy, hearing this, was incredibly amazed. He turned his head to the side to see who it was, but he could only notice bright purple hair in the crowd that was moving further and further away from him. And so, when some time had passed since that moment, Eric decided to go straight to the queen. The girl's assistant tried to stop him, but Sonetti herself allowed him to enter. When they were alone, Eric asked if it was true that the girl knew exactly who attacked them. Sonetti looked at him with a calm gaze and said that of course she knew perfectly well who it was, otherwise she would not have been able to understand where they ran off to. Then Eric suddenly started yelling at her, asking why she didn't punish this criminal if she already knew who it was. He didn't understand why they should leave it all unpunished. But the queen, smiling, asked why she had to tell him all this. She had already saved Karen countless times, so she saw no reason to explain everything to him. When Eric heard about this, he was very surprised. He did not know that she really did this. However, she asked that this time she tell him who it was so that he himself would impose the necessary punishment on this person. But Sinetti still didn't understand. Why did she suddenly have to do this after that? She asked, how long should she continue saving the girl? Looking at Eric, she said that if they don't think and don't find solutions themselves, then someday it might be too late to help, so she's not going to do everything for them all the time. She came closer to Eric and asked if Karen had conveyed to him properly about the place he would have to occupy in the future, and what responsibility would fall on his shoulders. Then Eric remembered the words of his teacher who said that when he entered the palace, everything would be completely different than it was before. Then Karen also told him that the leader must be able to read a move ahead and foresee the future, but the girl was absolutely sure that he could handle everything. Even the first time when he was awaiting the coronation, the crown smiled and said that he was the one who was personally chosen by her, so she was sure that he would definitely not be able to let her down. When Eric remembered all this, he felt a little ashamed and lowered his head because he really knew what he was getting into. However, for some reason, he was not properly prepared. When the queen saw his expression, she said that in the future, it would be best for him to change his attitude. Otherwise, he would not be able to hold on to Karen until the moment she left. Eric, hearing new information for himself, was incredibly amazed. He immediately raised his voice to find sleep and asked if she really had to go somewhere. He did not understand what this even meant. But Sinetti explained that it was not fitting for the new king to rely on someone else. So it would be best for him to take into account all her advice and make himself a new man who would be worthy of this position. The queen, leaving, said that she would make this choice for him, and she herself thought that she needed to do the same. Before going out the door, she turned and looked at the Erics for the last time, and also saw a strange expression on the man's face. With a smile on her face, she asked if he really thought that Karen would always be by his side. The girl thought it was very stupid on his part. When the man didn't respond, the queen just sighed and said that he was incredibly naive, and then she left him alone with his obsessive thoughts. And besides, she began to strongly doubt whether he would be able to protect even one of his people, not to mention the entire people who now lay on his fragile shoulders. Eric was shocked by the information he heard until the very evening. He still couldn't forget that Karen had to leave him somewhere, and because of this he became angrier and angrier each time. He didn't understand where the girl was supposed to go. He never imagined that Karen might not be around, and so even the thought that she would become alone scared him incredibly much. He believed that if he didn't think and didn't find a solution himself, it would someday be too late to help. But accordingly, it wasn't too late yet, and the man was going to fix the situation he found himself in. He was not going to allow what the situation was actively heading towards. So Eric was incredibly serious. It was deep night outside, and Karen was lying there trying to fall asleep because the day had been long and she was pretty tired. But for some reason, Carlin still couldn't fall asleep. She thought that she needed to have a normal talk with Eric and resolve everything. Because of her thoughts, she couldn't even rest peacefully. The girl thought that sometimes he was much calmer than her, so maybe everything would have happened without a scandal and shouting. So she began to blame herself even more for never having talked to him. However, then she began to remember that moment from the cave when they almost kissed and the girl was thrown into the heat. Karen realized that she herself almost kissed him because she was ready to respond to his kiss. It was incredibly difficult for her to comprehend the information that she had actually almost kissed Eric with her student. But at that moment, Karen's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. The girl was a little surprised because usually no one came to her at such a late hour. She immediately got out of bed to see who was there. First thing she asked who came, but no one answered her. In fact, she even told her servants that she wanted to rest in silence, so she really had no idea who it could be when Karen wanted to ask again. "Who is there?" She heard a familiar voice. This voice belonged, of course, to Eric, so she walked incredibly quickly to the door and opened it to let him in. When she opened the doors, a really upset Eric was standing in front of her. She was very glad that he came because she really wanted to talk to him. But she didn't even have time to say anything to him because as soon as the man saw Karen, he immediately laid his head on her shoulder, which of course confused her a little because she didn't understand what was wrong with him. She asked if everything was okay with him, but then suddenly the man said that he had a dream. His voice sounded very quiet and even somewhat frightened, Karen didn't understand at all why he was saying all this, so she asked him what kind of dream he had because she thought that it might calm him down. Then Eric replied that it was a dream in which she disappeared into a cave. He continued to wander and look for her, but he could not find her. Of course, he said this in a calm voice. However, Eric was still incredibly soft-hearted, so she understood that this must have upset him quite a bit. She wondered how on earth he could have decided to leave this innocent child just a moment ago, so she took him by the hand and began to lead him straight to the bed in order to talk to him calmly. Eric looked at her with a sad look and asked if she was sure that she wasn't hurt anywhere when she fell into the lake and remained in the cave. Karen said that of course everything was fine with her. After that, she sat him down on the sofa next to the bed and asked if he wanted 1,000,000 warm tea in order to calm down a little. But Eric refused this and simply asked her to hug him. Karen, of course, allowed him to do this, and the man explained that he needed her warmth. He was very scared, especially considering that dream, so he could no longer be alone. Karen, of course, did not want him to become so attached to her. She knew perfectly well that it was that spoon that was easy to figure out. He said it specifically in order to hug her. But for some reason, she didn't want to let him go, so I continued to hug him. She told him not to worry. She was there so that he could calm down already. He lay next to her for a while, and then suddenly stood up and said that for some reason, he didn't feel any relief, and that even being so close to her wasn't enough for him. Then Eric decided to take the situation into his own hands. He suddenly moved closer to his teacher and began to quickly kiss her right on the lips. Of course, Karen was incredibly surprised by this. However, for some reason, she did not push him away but only began to reciprocate his kiss. Then the girl felt that she was just starting to lose her mind after some time of kissing. She realized that she should have pushed him away and not continued all this. It would have been right. She tried to push away from him, but for some reason, Eric suddenly began to stretch her nightgown. The girl understood perfectly well that this should not be done. However, for some time, she did nothing. But when the girl already felt that his hands began to go lower, she realized that this was too much. She immediately pushed Eric off of herself and began to cover her unbuttoned shirt with her hands. She tried to address him in a calm voice. Although it was very difficult to do, the girl, slipping out of him, said that she thought that it was definitely wrong to do this, so it was better for them to stop. She looked him straight in the eyes and said that he was her student and she was his teacher, so they definitely should not do something like that under any circumstances. But Eric did not want to listen to all this. He put his hand on her cheek and said that the thought of this did not arise only today. He dreamed about it throughout every day. He suddenly ran his thumb over her lips and asked if she even understood how much he was afraid of losing her and how dear she was to him. Karen tried to continue the dialogue with him. She told Eric that she would not disappear anywhere, so he should not worry so much, and they certainly did not need to rush. The man continued to look very agitated. He said that it was all a lie and then asked if it was true that she would leave precisely for his sake. He already knew everything in advance. Karen kept her hands on his chest to keep him from getting closer, and she asked if he really thought she would do this for him. Eric was about to say something, but he suddenly fell silent. Tears welled up in his eyes. He didn't know what to say, and Karen at the same time felt her whine. After all this time she had not thought at all about his feelings and could not even suspect that in this way she had seriously hurt him. The girl understood that the best way to correct this guilt was to talk to him. So, looking Eric straight in the eyes, she said in a confident voice that she would be by his side until he ascended the throne and became a wise king. And if he becomes a tyrant, then she will scold him, asking, "Did she really teach him to act exactly like that?" At that moment, Karen even laughed in order to dilute the atmosphere between them a little. At that moment, Eric's gaze became a little calmer, and Karen assured him that he definitely didn't need to worry about anything anymore. She would be by his side. But to the girl's surprise, for some reason the guy did not calm down, but only with even greater zeal began to reach out to kiss her. Of course, Karen did not like this at all. When he touched her lips, Karen pushed him away again and looked at Eric in surprise, realizing that her conversation had absolutely no effect on him. The guy looked at her in surprise and asked if he really couldn't do this. Karen already wanted to say something. However, for some reason she began to hesitate about what exactly to answer him. Of course, he shouldn't have done this, and Karen was well aware of it and understood it. However, she didn't want to make him cry again, so she took the initiative into her own hands and decided to kiss him first. Now the man was the first to push her away from himself and asked if this was really how she gave him permission to kiss her now. At first, Karen didn't respond to this. She didn't know what to tell him, so she simply nodded her head in agreement because she didn't want to say it out loud. Then Eric was very happy. He immediately moved closer to her again and began to kiss her lips. The man continued to kiss her, and with his other hand began to take off her clothes. Karen felt simply amazing. Despite the fact that she was perfectly aware that this was completely wrong to do, Eric at the same time was very happy. He was ready to become absolutely anyone for her sake, and if she wants him to be king, then of course, he will become one for Karen. The man had already gone too far, so he didn't want to stop. Soon he took off absolutely all of the girl's clothes and descended into the lower part of her body. He started doing everything so that Karen would feel incredibly pleasant and she would really feel amazing. However, she asked him to stop because she was very ashamed and she could not continue. But Eric said that if he doesn't do this, then it will be very painful for her in the future. So he simply has to do all this before starting. But Karen said that she actually didn't know anything like this because she had never even thought that she would have to do something like this. Eric replied that he had the same thing. After that, he began to engage in the main process and entered the girl's body. It was amazing for both of them and the guy. And the girl enjoyed the process. Karen felt so amazing that she couldn't even hold back her tears. She had never experienced such feelings before, but it was the best thing that ever happened to her. At that moment, Eric thought that Karen should not have brought him to this place from Wellington. He is much more greedy and persistent than she imagined, and that is why he will always achieve what he wants. Also, the man was not going to allow anything that fell into his hands to be taken away. This, of course, directly concerned Karen, so he was ready to fight for her to the last blood. While they continued to engage in a very pleasant process, Karen could not believe that they were really doing this together. She had never even thought of something like this. The girl also thought that when the morning came, he would disappear. It would all be like a dream. So she was going to enjoy everything she had as much as possible. Many hours passed since then, and Karen finally woke up. The sun was shining brightly outside the window, which meant that a new day had already arrived. As soon as she opened her eyes, she immediately remembered what happened last night and thought that she was really crazy, and Carl did not understand why she just could not refuse it. She should have told the guy in a stern voice that he was her student and she was his teacher, so such a relationship would violate all the rules, so they shouldn't even exist. However, for reasons inexplicable to Karen, she did not do so, and for some reason still spent that night with her student. At some point, the pencil thought that perhaps this was all actually her dream. However, from those memories of the previous night, she became incredibly ashamed, and it was difficult to believe that this was all unreal. Her memories were too vivid. She didn't even know what emotion to use when she saw Eric, because this whole situation was definitely beyond her understanding. As soon as the girl woke up, she sat up in bed and already wanted to turn to Eric, thinking that he had stayed the night with her. But when Karen turned her head to the side, she saw that the second part of the bed was completely empty. This greatly misled the girl. She did not understand what had happened, but it still made her happy to some extent. Karen assumed that he was probably busy with royal affairs, so he left in a hurry as early as possible so as not to arouse suspicion. She began to get out of bed and thought that he simply took pity on her after last night and decided not to wake her up either. This was all really true. Little by little, she calmed the girl down. Karen stood up and kept thinking about what she should say and how she should behave in front of the man when they met. All of this was really very difficult for her to even comprehend. In fact, at that moment, Eric was at the home of that beautiful dark-haired girl who had planned something evil. When she saw him, she could not believe her eyes. She said, smiling, that she would never have thought that the prince would send her an invitation. Eric, in turn, replied that he was a little late with the invitation. He looked at the girl and said that, as she already knew, a very unpleasant incident had occurred at the hunting festival, so he would like to talk about it. The girl smiled and said that she heard that the prince's teacher was in danger and almost died, so she asked if everything was okay with her. But Eric understood perfectly well that all this was feigned politeness. After all, it was this woman who, passing by him on the day of the incident, did not understand how she was able to return alive. Therefore, sighing heavily, he turned to Genya and said that the great queen of this country told him that a powerful force needed comments from someone who could support her. Looking her straight in the eyes, he said that he had no doubt that the Pax family would be an excellent partner for the kingdom of Rayhan. He said, as the one who inherits the throne after Queen Sunnydee, "I am interested in Lady Jenny Pax's intention to be the sole heir of the family." In fact, they were both one of a kind. So when Janice heard about this, she was a little surprised, but in a pleasant way. So she smiled, and of course could not refuse the prince. She smiled, and told the prince that the Pax family, as always, would do everything possible for the prosperity of the kingdom. So she herself would be happy to participate in everything that was needed. Eric sighed heavily and replied that he was glad that her intentions coincided with hers, so he was already getting ready to leave. But the girl suddenly stopped him and said that she also wanted something as valuable as her precious loyalty, so she asked him not to leave so quickly. The man immediately asked her to say what she wanted in general, and Janice replied that she would like to receive the tiara of the Red Sun of Reykjavik. Smiling, yes, she asked if the man would give her this very tiara. The girl was really proud of herself. She thought that she had come up with a simply perfect plan. When Eric heard this, he was a little shocked. So for a while, he didn't even know what to answer her. However, in the end, he said that of course he would fulfill her request. Janice thought at that moment that he had finally begun to succumb to her charms. And that meant that very soon she would put her plan into action and put him on a short leash. Some time has passed since then, and now the girl has finally received the most valuable treasure of Reiki, the very same tiara that she asked the prince for. In fact, the royal family was now in her hands. She was truly a delightful beauty and therefore could not help but be even more proud of herself. But for now, she was still a little worried about the reason why the men were doing this to her. She assumed that perhaps it was because of the prince's teacher. Janice asked the prince about this when she came for her tiara, but Eric replied that he didn't understand. Would anything really change if he said that it was really so? Well, in fact, Janice didn't answer him anything. She just took her thing and went home, and she was very proud of herself because she was able to do a little to make the man worry. In fact, Janice is a teacher who is very annoying. However, she was going to use her even in her situation. So, you just had to wait a little and she would be able to tame him. And soon after, various sensations about the scandal involving Prince Eric and Lady Jenny Pax began to spread throughout the city. People immediately started buying newspapers because they were curious about what had happened, and eventually their theories began to be confirmed. Someone in the city heard that they were dancing at the party, and so after reading the news they realized that the prince would finally join forces with the Pax family, and accordingly this would mean a new era for them. Since Jenny got the tiara, it meant that she was already a princess. Yes, we were very shocked to hear the news because some of them couldn't even talk to the prince. He eventually managed to get married. The headlines were loud. Some said that Prince Eric was present at the party as Jenny Bucks's partner. Other headlines talked about Jenny Park asking to prepare her wedding dress to go with the tiara, and of course about an alliance between their two families. And Karen, who was walking around the city on that very day of the sensation, was very shocked when she saw the headlines of these newspapers. That same day, she went to meet the queen and found her son, who in turn warned her that she did not intend to raise issues in the hunting competition. Hearing about this, Karen was very surprised and even indignant. After all, this is exactly why she came to talk. The girl said that the prince had prepared a pretty good alternative, so she believed that it could be paid off in reality. Smiling, she told you that it was certainly not difficult to identify who was behind the incident at the hunting competition. However, there was no need to make a big deal out of it, and let everyone know that the prince's position was rather precarious. She said that something was needed that would show the strength of the prince's position. And then suddenly the queen smiled, because she knew that her plan was simply brilliant. The girl said that nothing gives such a sense of stability as marriage to a representative of a noble family. So this news was definitely able to outdo everything else in the world. Of course, it was very unpleasant for Karen to hear about all this. However, she tried not to show it. Therefore, she simply told the queen that she understood everything. Sonetti said that even if we put aside the assessment of Jenny's personality, the Fax family would become a very big support for the prince, so it was impossible to ignore them. The queen said that after the prince finally ascended the throne, it would be more convenient to have them as allies rather than enemies. That is why this decision was the most correct in their case. Of course, Karen was happy about the fact that Eric would have a reliable family at hand. This was certainly incredibly useful for him. However, after that day, namely the night that they spent together, there was not a single message from Eric to Karen. Because of this, she was still quite worried. She thought that if they ever did meet, she would even rehearse how to greet him so that it would be more natural and would not cause discomfort to both of them. She really did make all these attempts and thought everything out in detail in advance so that their relationship would not deteriorate. But in the end, they never even met, and she found out about this terrible news. When Karen saw in the newspapers that they were now supposed to get married, her hands even started shaking. She didn't know what to call this feeling. However, it was incredibly unpleasant for her. At some point, she even wondered if she really hoped that they would have something special and that some future relationship could also develop. Karen thought that she was a real idiot. Since the queen, who was sitting opposite her at that moment, thought so, She noticed that the girl was so worried about something that it was very visible. Therefore, Sonetti asked what the Countess was going to do next. When Karen heard such a strange question, she immediately asked again what she meant. But the Queen said that she was talking about the time after the royal power passed to Eric. What she was going to do with him. Karina. You hear, she thought about it seriously, but in fact she didn't even know what to answer because all this time she didn't think about it. The Queen then said that the Countess's intention she understood perfectly well, and she, as the boss, considered it a really good idea especially for her. However, on the other hand, Sonetti replied that this also meant the loss of an excellent aunt who could protect the prince's path. So she asked Karen if the girl was really going to just up and leave Eric alone. At that moment, she immediately remembered that very night when Eric came to her upset because he thought that she would leave him. Now she considered the words spoken that night to be completely useless, so the girl did not even know what to do in such a case. Sonetti, who continued to wait for her answer, said that since the girl could not answer right away, this means that something is bothering her a lot. When the girl saw the confusion on her face, she immediately calmed Karen down and said that she still had time. She also explained to the sonnet that this was the path that the Countess had chosen, so she had to make the choice herself. She had time to think carefully so she could take her time. The Queen smiled happily and said that she was, after all, simply a wonderful ruler and asked if she thought the same about the girls. But Karen, remembering all her orders and prohibitions to do anything, of course did not think so, but she could not answer that way. So, smiling nervously, she said that of course she was a wonderful ruler. They sat for a while and talked, drinking tea, and after that the girl left. Of course, she couldn't tell Eric that she was leaving. She didn't understand why she had promised him to be there if she was going to break that promise anyway. However, Karen nevertheless believed that they still had a little time that they spent together, and for her it was simply wonderful. But because the girl began to think about this more and more often, she even began to scold herself for these thoughts because she did not want to get hung up on Eric, who now had his own life separate from hers. She even thought that the next time they met she would simply punch him in the face, and at that moment, the girl waved her hand, practicing her punch, and didn't even notice that someone had come up behind her. Karen felt her fist hit something. Then she turned back to see who it was and saw Eric. The girl definitely didn't expect this. She immediately took his hand and asked if everything was okay with him, because the blow was quite strong. And she also asked him for forgiveness, saying that she didn't think at all that someone was positive about her. And then she wondered how he could possibly be okay after such an unexpected punch to the face. But the guy replied that he was fine, so she didn't have to worry about it. He immediately said that what was more important was that he missed Karen incredibly, so he couldn't help but start hugging the girl tightly and didn't let her go for some time. As soon as Karen saw this, she was very shocked. She did not understand what happened, and she was also angry at herself because just a minute ago, she was angry at him. But now she enjoyed his hugs. The girl put her hands on his back and thought that in this way, she would definitely fall under Eric's influence again. So after that, she pretty quickly pushed him away from herself. She got angry at the guy and shouted at Eric and told him to stop all this. As soon as he saw such a sharp reaction from the prince, he didn't understand why she was so still. But the girl said in a very serious voice that they did not have such a relationship, so he was forbidden to show such physical contact with her anymore. Karen finally sorted out her feelings and realized that she was still angry at him because she didn't understand how he could act so irresponsibly towards her. Eric was sincerely amazed. He immediately turned to the teacher in a sad voice and asked, was she really going to pretend that nothing happened after that hot night with him? He would be very upset if she actually said that she wanted to behave exactly like that. But Karen seemed even more emotional than he expected. She screamed at him and asked what other hot night he was talking about, because he himself never contacted her after that day. Pretended as if nothing had happened between them and simply disappeared. But Eric was also indignant. He said that, by the way, it was she who had not gotten in touch, and that was precisely why he should be angry with her. When Karen heard about this, she was very surprised and immediately asked what he was talking about, because she really didn't understand why he thought that. Eric explained that he sent letters every day asking if he could visit her, but ultimately never received a single response. As soon as the girl heard about this, she was very surprised because she had never received a single letter. Well, the prince sighed heavily and said that she was probably swamped with work and therefore didn't check her personal mailbox, and therefore didn't see all the letters that he sent her, and therefore thought that he was ignoring her. Karen, upon hearing about this, immediately felt guilty because she really hadn't checked anything. But the girl decided not to show that she was the one to blame, so she said that he could have sent a person. But Eric explained that he simply did not want to burden her or distract her from work, so he believed that letters in this case were the most adequate option. After all, when she had time, she would read and respond. At that moment, the girl felt incredibly awkward. She felt very ashamed because all this time, in fact, it was she who did not contact him, because the man did all possible methods to talk. Then Eric suddenly took her hair in his hand and asked if this really meant that his teacher had been wrong about him all this time. He couldn't believe that she really thought that he was frivolous about such things. It was hard for him to imagine that this was the kind of man he was in her eyes. Karen felt even more awkward. She said that in fact it was not about that at all, but the man kissed the ends of her hair and said that in fact it was a little offensive. Karen immediately responded that in fact she had misunderstood everything, and it was her mistake that she really had not checked her mailbox. In order not to remain in this awkward situation any longer, she was about to simply leave. However, Eric stopped her and said that he would like to show her something. Of course, the girl did not expect this. However, she agreed to go with him, and soon they came to the library where there were a lot of different old books. And Eric showed her the very first scientific journal, which was written by Avocado Taurus, which was a national treasure and could only be read in the royal palace. As soon as Karen saw this treasure, she could not contain her admiration. Her eyes literally sparkled with happiness. She could not believe that she was actually holding it in her hands. Eric smiled happily and said that he remembered that she always wanted to see this book. So he did everything possible to ensure that she could finally read it. Karen, who admired it all the time, said that this view is a national treasure that not everyone can see. So it was incredibly valuable to her, and she believed that she would never be able to even look at it in her life. She looked at the prince with hope and asked if she could read it right now. Eric smiled happily and said that, of course, because that was exactly why he invited her. Then Karen began to slowly open this book. In fact, they said that all scientists are ready to read the soul in order to even just hold it in their hands. And she was allowed to look at what was written there. And when she was about to open the book, for some reason she got stuck and didn't do it. The prince, of course, was immediately surprised. He came closer to her and asked what was wrong. But Karen looked at him with a pitiful look and thanked him, of course, for this book. However, she said that she would not be able to read it. She asked what if she continued to abuse his power. Of course, she didn't want that. That's why she refused even such a small thing. She also said that it is always difficult only the first time, but it will definitely be easier later. So she warned him never to do that again and not to give her special privileges because it was wrong. Eric smiled at that moment and thought that his teacher was incredibly sweet to him. He even wanted to hug her again. However, he held back. The guy said that he would definitely do it so that she could see all of this. He just needed a little time and patience. Karen didn't understand what he was talking about and asked what he meant. Eric explained that he was going to use a magical video projector so that anyone could see the contents of this book, so that it would be possible to reduce the degree of damage to the book and everyone would be able to find out what was actually written there. He explained that it was on this book that he wanted to test his wonderful project for the first time. So Karen didn't have to worry at all about receiving any privileges, because that was not the case at all. When the girl heard about this, she was sincerely amazed. She could not understand how such a brilliant idea came into his head, because it really opened up many new possibilities for people. The prince smiled happily and said that his great teacher had said that there should be no inequality in learning, and he wanted to show her the book before it became public knowledge. He believed that she was worthy of being the first to read its contents. The girl didn't answer this. Then the guy thoughtfully said that if you think about it, this could also seem like an abuse of power, and therefore he was not sure of his decision. He said that next time he would definitely be much more careful and also asked her to forgive him this time and still take advantage of this wonderful opportunity. Karen already wanted to answer him something, but she didn't have time because Eric suddenly reached out and, unexpectedly for the girl, kissed her right on the lips. She immediately pushed him away from her when she realized what was happening and screamed loudly at him, asking what he was doing. She walked a few meters away from him and said that it was definitely wrong to do that. After all, he now had a fiancée, so it was wrong and immoral to do that. When Eric heard about the bride, he was very surprised. He didn't understand what she was even talking about. He immediately asked what other bride he had, but Karen immediately said that of course they were talking about Jean and Pascal. She heard that he even gave her a tiara. At that moment, Eric suddenly smiled. He took the girl by the waist and, hugging her, began to bring her closer to him, and also asked if this really meant that his teacher was jealous. The girl immediately asked him to let her go and also did not understand what kind of nonsense he was talking about, like jealousy. But Eric, putting his head on her shoulder, looked at the girl and asked, "Did you really want me to be engaged then?" Karen didn't know how to answer this. Then continue to push off from the man, she explained that it is better for the prince to have a girl from a noble family nearby. But Eric interrupted her and said that he was talking about something completely different. He asked what she herself thought about all this, and not how the norms say. In the end, she still managed to remove his hands from her waist. She moved him further away from her and said that of course she also thought that it would be better for them. At that moment, Eric thought that she certainly didn't know how to lie, and because of that he even smiled slightly. Seeing the confusion on her face, he immediately explained that he had indeed given the girl a tiara. However, there was no official announcement of the engagement. But Karen, lowering her head, explained that sometimes the meaning that things give is very great. Like the ring that the queen put on the prince's finger, for example. The man with the stern voice explained that he didn't care at all what meaning other people attached to it. What was important to him was what exactly he himself had in mind when he gave this thing. But Karen continued to argue with him. She said that he was in such a position that he could not ignore it. If he wanted to become king, he had to be careful in every action he took. When the girl said this phrase, she realized that she had phrased it too sharply. So she said that this was his situation now, and in the future this burden would only become heavier. Therefore, before deciding anything, he must think about everything again and calculate every move in advance. At that moment, he suddenly took the girl and pulled her closer to him. He simply started kissing her again. It didn't matter to him at all that she was trying to push him away. He continued to do it. This went on for some time. He sat the girl on the table and had already begun to gradually take off her clothes, but Karen was able to stop him in time. She asked him to stop for at least a minute. The girl had rather mixed feelings about this, so she looked at Eric and said that there were a lot of people outside, and besides, they were in the library, so she thought that it was definitely wrong to do this. Eric said that if problems screamed that they were in this place, then they could calmly move to another and continue. He was in no hurry. But the girl said that the problem was not in the place at all. Eric had enough of that. So he took off his shirt and said that in that case she was not worried at all. In the end, Karen I was able to resist. She succumbed to this temptation, and neither the place nor the people who were outside prevented them from having fun. This went on for some time, and Karen did not think at all about the consequences that awaited her after this, nor about how this could affect their entire situation. She just accepted it and enjoyed what she had. However, when the evening came, Corona realized that she had made a huge mistake and ended up sleeping with him again. Although she had intended to distance herself from this man, sitting in her office, the girl thought that she had done this in the royal library as well. And this alarmed her even more. She still couldn't understand why her heart melted so much as soon as she saw Eric. She even seriously thought about the fact that perhaps this guy was just her type, and she just didn't realize it. Because of some kind of overwhelming guilt, she felt as if she was a criminal who was leaving the palace, and after they finished their business, she ran incredibly quickly back to her estate. Then Eric said that he had nothing with Jenny Pascal. He really said that they really didn't have the kind of relationship that Karen could even think about. He asked her not to misunderstand him. And the girl, who at that moment rather wanted to leave, simply nodded her head in agreement. However, now that she analyzed the whole situation, she understood that she had acted like a jealous lover. But they weren't even lovers, so it was even worse for her. She didn't even know what to call the relationship they had. Karen knew that the things they did were usually done when they loved each other, and that meant that Eric probably loved her. Then Karen also thought about the fact that perhaps she loved him. But the girl did not have time to develop this thought to the end because suddenly someone knocked on her office door. The girl allowed them to come in. It was Marie. She smiled happily and brought a whole cart with tea and sweets. The woman said that this time she baked cookies that the Countess loved very much. She herself was still incredibly red. The maid, noticing this, asked if the mistress was in any pain. The girl replied that everything was fine. Then they decided to start drinking tea and not ask each other unnecessary questions. To dispel their awkward silence, Karen said that she had met with His Highness the Prince that day, and he had also asked her to convey his greetings to Maria. When the woman heard this, she was pleasantly surprised and thanked her for it. And after that, she began asking Karen about how he was eating and whether he had grown even more. She asked if everything was okay with his health, because in the off-season it was very easy to catch a cold. Smiling, the girl replied that everything was fine with him, so she didn't have to worry. And Masha also said that they would probably take good care of him in the royal palace, so she probably shouldn't worry so much. The Countess smiled happily and replied that Masha had been his nanny for all these years, so her concern was quite natural, and she didn't have to worry about it. The maid thoughtfully said that time really flies by very quickly, and it seems as if only yesterday the Countess visited Wellington for the first time, and now the man has become a real prince and will soon become king. Karen agreed with her. Then the maid said that despite the fact that she was quite late, however, she wanted to say a big thank you to the Countess for everything, because if it weren't for her, then this definitely wouldn't have happened. Maria, holding back tears, said that if it weren't for the girl the young gentleman left alone, would never have left the borders of his duchy. The woman said that since she appeared in Reichstag, young Mr. Eric had changed incredibly. He had learned a lot and smiled often, and all this, of course, was thanks to Karen. If she had looked after him alone, it would have been much more difficult. But when the boy grew up in such a pleasant and friendly environment, everything became completely different. The Countess smiled happily and said that this became possible thanks to Masha and the teacher, who had always been her support, so it was not worth forgetting about their incredibly important work. When Masha heard these words, she still could not hold back her tears. She thanked the girl for these words and said that now she understands why the young gentleman respects her so much, because she is truly a wonderful person. When Kara heard about respect, she immediately felt a little uneasy, because remembering what was between them, it was difficult to say what kind of feelings the man had for her. And when Maria spoke about respect, the girl seriously thought about it and realized that the feelings that he had for her were closer to this than to love. Suddenly finding himself in a dangerous situation, he probably confused it with the attraction he felt for the first time. And her feelings for Eric probably couldn't be called true love. Karen herself didn't know what she felt. When the next day came, Eric found himself in his office filling out paperwork, and for some reason, Janice came to him without warning. The girl was wearing a short dress and sighing heavily. She did not understand how it was possible to work in the office in such weather. The man ignored her words and just glanced at her and said that she had come without warning, so he did not understand why she was also indignant. Eric also said that he had things to do, and if she had something not urgent to do with him, then he would suggest that they meet next time so that she would not wait for him for a long time. But the woman was happy and smiling and said that since he was saying that, she would also like to do her own thing. At that moment, the girl sat down next to him on a chair and reached out to kiss him. Of course, she didn't succeed. Eric pushed her away from him and said that if they were to sit at the same chair, the two of them wouldn't be able to do anything, so he would advise her to leave. Janice was very angry because all this time she could not show him the attention she needed to interest the man even more. The girl also could not understand why he behaved this way with her. She was sure that Eric could not help but know what it meant to receive the tiara, and therefore for her such aloof behavior of his was very strange. She couldn't believe that he really thought that she had published those wonderful articles in vain and taken him with her. Everywhere around, everyone already considered her the next princess. However, for some reason, Eric was not included in this number, but she still couldn't understand later why she couldn't tame Eric directly. He should have already demanded that she touch him. However, this was not the case. She also thought that he didn't even need to try to dominate her. After all, she definitely wouldn't allow that. For some time, Janice thought about what to do, and soon she came up with an idea. She turned to the guy with a smile on her face, and he immediately turned his head towards her. The girl asked if he would like to organize a ball on behalf of His Highness for everyone around him. As soon as Eric heard about the ball, he was a little surprised, but Janice smiled and said that he had never held a ball since arriving at the palace. And this would be an opportunity to show everyone the strong friendship between the royal family and the House of Pascal. Of course, the man understood that it was a really good offer, so he seriously thought about it and tried to understand whether it would be beneficial for him. But Janice suddenly smiled and said that since everything was already heading in that direction, she asked to invite all the arrest officers. The girl also said that since the future king was organizing a ball, it should be grand and magnificent so that people would definitely remember it. Of course, Jenny suggested this whole idea to him because she was going to stand next to him on this floor in the theater, and then he would invite her to dance in front of everyone. She thought the idea was absolutely amazing and thought that it would all work out perfectly, and she would finally be able to get him to pay attention to her. For a while, Eric was silent. However, he then said that, in fact, if you think about it, her words were really true, and this idea was not so bad. So get up from your seat. He said that's exactly what they're going to do. It's all going to be grand and lavish. Jeannie was very happy to hear this. She said that this would truly be the most dazzling and important day in recent times. Soon, news about the ball's arranged principle also reached Karen, and it was because of this Dick that there was now an incredible amount of different paperwork. One of her assistants took the girl an incredibly large number of papers and said that Since this was the first ball organized by the prince, there was a request to make every effort. Karen, hearing about this, immediately thought about it and realized that indeed, after the hunting festival, there were no events organized by the royal family. She also thought that this was a good opportunity to demonstrate the close connection between the queen and Eric, and for this very reason she was not going to refuse to help him, of course. One of her assistants suddenly smiled and said, "Perhaps this time they want to officially introduce Lady Janice on Sky as the future wife of the prince." When the girl heard this, she was very shocked and immediately asked what he was talking about, but the assistant replied that there were just rumors about the wedding of the prince and the girl, and that's what he said. He also said that it would be a gang where they most likely plan to show that the rumors are true before announcing their engagement. The men also said that there were already various rumors going around that Marquis Pascal was preparing his daughter's wedding. Some say that even the queen did not deny the recent drinking, so very soon they will even have to prepare a wedding. Of course, Karen heard all this. It was incredibly unpleasant, so she hid her hand, just told him to stop officially. Nothing had been announced yet. So she advised him not to give in to rumors and to honestly just take and do his job. After that, the girl gave him some papers and asked him to bring an estimate. The assistant, who was incredibly frightened by the girl's violent reaction, immediately ran away in order not to be left alone with her. Karen, meanwhile, went to the window and thought about the fact that even if Eric had no feelings for Jenna Pascal, still, being the most pleasant, there were situations that had to be dealt with, and such a situation was just one of them. It was most likely a marriage for the sake of state interests, so Karen believed that what happened last time should not happen again. So she was going to control herself. Then the girl suddenly came out of the office and said that she needed to leave for a while. Her employees immediately said that there was no problem with that and got back to their work. They also told her to come back quickly. At that very time, the queen and the prince were sitting at dinner, and Senet turned to the man and said that she had heard that he wanted to throw a ball. She also said that it was very commendable that he came to this decision himself. However, the man said that he came up with it for me on his own. After all, it was Lady Jenny and Pascal's proposal. The woman said that this means that her son probably understands what kind of event this will be. She asked in surprise if this was really the method he had found. Of course, the girl immediately understood that she meant the words she had told him at the very beginning. Eric also understood what method she meant, so he immediately said that it was exactly like that. The queen suddenly smiled and replied that it was even good. The girl took her glass of wine in her hands and smiling looked at him, saying that anyway she would hand over the throne to him and leave so it would be his concern. Of course, the Pascal family was very difficult to deal with. However, the woman said that this is the family that makes a great contribution to the kingdom. But then suddenly Eric said that he decided that the royal family should not make enemies so easily. The girl, hearing this, was a little surprised and asked, "Is this really why he decided that it would be a better idea to tie the knot?" The man sighed heavily and turned to his mother and said that she once said that a monarch is someone who asserts his authority, and authority is fear caused by cruelty, or conditional loyalty can be achieved through benefit. The queen, hearing this, agreed with him and said that everything was so. However, in order to get something, you need something, and losing this time must have been a lesson for Eric. But Sinetti still considered this act to be a rather unexpected choice. But she did not tell him anything else so that he could make all the decisions on his own. Then suddenly Eric stood up from his seat and said that he did not understand why she assumed that he was losing something. The queen already wanted to tell him something. However, the guy suddenly smiled and replied that he had completely forgotten to tell her something. Smiling, Eric said that he had a matter for which he would like to receive permission directly from the queen. At that very moment, Karen, who had left work to do something, went to the bookstore. She believed that there was no place better than a bookstore when there was a hurricane in her head, and that was the reason she went there. But when the girl took one of the books to distract herself, memories of the evening she spent with Eric in the library suddenly came to her mind. And as soon as these memories came into her head, the girl at some point even thought that she had simply gone crazy because she couldn't even concentrate on the book. Karen couldn't even imagine that she could be such a slutty girl. She put the book aside and thought that this couldn't go on any longer. She had to pull herself together. She thought that being a rational person all her life should accordingly support the principle more than anyone else for the sake of their kingdom. She also believed that if she couldn't, she needed to think in advance about what else she could do for the guy, so that her usefulness would not end. Eventually, after sitting in the bookstore for a while, Karen realized that she couldn't concentrate there either. So she was going to go and get something tasty to eat, and when the girl was about to come forward, she did not notice that some man appeared right in front of her. Because of this, she collided right with him. At some point, the girl even felt that she was starting to fall. Because of this, she grabbed this unfamiliar guy and pulled him up after her. But when Karen looked at this man, she realized that it was not a stranger at all. This guy's name was Paul, and she knew him very well. When the girl continued to hold onto his shirt and they continued to fall, the floor also recognized her, so this surprise was mutual. In the end, they were unable to stay on their feet, so Karen fell straight onto the guy and smiled happily and said that a lot of time had passed since their last meeting. In fact, the last time they saw each other was after they graduated from school. Paul smiled happily and said that he thought it wasn't her, but now that he looked more closely, he really recognized her. But they didn't even have time to talk normally when suddenly one of the store's security guards came up to them because they were making a lot of noise and disorder. He immediately put his hands on his chest and looked at them angrily. The boy and the girl guessed that he would now have trouble, so they immediately took the books, began to put them away, and asked the man for forgiveness. Karen suggested that Paul go out and talk to the outside and she could even treat him to something tasty, and she herself began to clean up everything around because they really made a very serious mess. And Paul, who was incredibly happy to see his old classmate, even smiled. He really didn't expect this meeting. However, it turned out to be very pleasant for him. In the end, of course, he came closer to Karen and decided to help her clean everything up. So they finished pretty quickly and left the bookstore so that they wouldn't get scolded even more. So soon after that, they ran into a small coffee shop, got themselves a sandwich, and came to the park in order to have a really heartfelt conversation after the table in time. Paul spoke to her first. He said that she had said earlier that she wanted to buy and pass him something tasty. However, he did not think that it could be exactly such a sandwich. Smiling, he looked at the girl and said that it made him nostalgic. Karen laughed and said that it was true. They often ate them when they were studying at university because they simply didn't have enough time for anything else. After that, the girl asked what he was doing in these parts at all. After all, he had never come here since graduation, so she was very surprised when she saw her here. Paul replied that he was told that if he didn't come this year, the budget for the scientific conference would be cut. So he simply had to visit this place. The girl, hearing this, immediately remembered that she had heard that he had opened an investigation center in his homeland. She also said that he was a great guy, and that this was truly a praiseworthy thing. The man, who was a little embarrassed, immediately said that there was nothing special about it. But Karen said that it was not so. After that, she asked how things were going for him at the research center. Paul said that he actually liked it there, and it was quite an interesting job, although when something didn't work out, he couldn't even sleep out of despair. The man thoughtfully said that doing what he loves and conducting research is really fun, so overall he was even happy with what he did. At that moment, Karen thought that this was the future she dreamed of if she left her administrative work at night without sleep as immersed only in research. This is the life of a scientist who expanded new worlds. The girl believed that if she had lived after leaving Reichstag as she had planned, then perhaps now she would have achieved even greater success and enjoyed the wonderful life that she had always dreamed of. Then, suddenly, Paul said that sometimes he even misses the old days. He really enjoyed studying with her at the university, so sometimes he indulged himself with various memories from the past. So he said that even when it was hard for him because of the many tasks, it was a lot of fun, so he doesn't regret anything, but only remembers with warmth everything that happened in those years. The girl was a little surprised to hear this, because she herself did not often remember the university. And suddenly the man said that in fact, he often heard about her and the news that her student became the crown prince. At that moment, Karen smiled awkwardly and said that in fact that's how it turned out and he really did become one. When they had an awkward silence, Paul suddenly said that he actually missed her. But unfortunately, Karen couldn't hear what he said because a strong wind blew, and she simply didn't hear. Soon, the wind finally died down, and Karen asked again what exactly he said. The man at that moment answered that there was nothing important there. He did not want to repeat these words because he was not so brave. So step up from your seat. The guy just offered her to eat another sandwich. Karen, who was still a little hungry, didn't refuse, so they went back to that cafe. But the guy left her sitting on the bench and said that he would go and buy it himself. He needed to be alone after that. Paul asked if it was true that she needed it with a lot of hot sauce. Several hours passed from that moment, and when Karen returned home late in the evening, she was combing her hair and thinking about everything the guy had told her. The girl didn't expect to hear about his research center. However, she thought that it sounded really cool and suggested that she might like this job. She put the brush aside and suddenly thought about it and realized that she had apparently decided to leave the region too thoughtlessly. It was not so easy to settle down again on foreign soil. She had not even taken this into account. However, she didn't really want to return to her homeland either, because that place certainly didn't give her any pleasure. Her homeland was Abelbar. Then she suddenly remembered that just recently her sister had sent her a letter saying that she was coming to visit her. The girl walked up to the bed and lay down on it. She thought about how much time had passed since this letter arrived, because she had completely forgotten about it for some time. Karen assumed that she would probably arrive very soon, but she still did not understand why her sister would go to Reichstag. She was very curious, but she definitely didn't want to know about it because she thought that her sister was a real hurricane. Karen thought about all this for a while, but then she put everything in its place and thought that she should have concentrated on her work. She believed that she would be able to think about it with her sister after she had successfully completed the appointment. But until that time, all her thoughts had to be occupied only with this matter. And so, when some time had passed since then, the ball was finally organized and many aristocrats gathered there. The noble ladies, as always, started to spread rumors first. One of the girls said that some people say that the prince personally arranged this ball. So they assumed that he tried hard because the atmosphere was wonderful. Some also said that he made it so that civil society organizations and students could attend upon request. And now they understood why they saw so many young people at this event. The girls all agreed that it was something new and interesting, and they were looking forward to what steps His Highness the Prince would take in the future. Karen, who stood not far from these ladies and heard good reviews, finally exhaled, because when she first received this offer, she was worried about the reaction of the aristocrats. The girl also thought that Eric was making his own way well, so her help might not be needed soon. Shortly thereafter, the butler announced the arrival of His Highness the Crown Prince and Lady Pax. The guests immediately began to look at the front door, and as soon as they saw Ladybug, they were incredibly surprised because the girl came in her tiara. She walked next to Eric holding his hand. They had matching suits, so they looked pretty good together. Karen, who was standing in the crowd and watching all this, was a little upset because it hurt her to look at this happy couple. In the end, the girl was not going to stand there. She turned around and walked away from him in order not to hurt herself even more. But by chance, when Karen turned around, she suddenly crashed into the man again. She asked him for forgiveness, and when she looked up, she was incredibly amazed at who exactly she crashed into. People meanwhile continued to watch the gait of Eric and his partner, seeing the tiara on her head. They assumed that all those rumors were indeed true. Now it became clear to them why the Marquis Pa had recently begun to behave differently. After all, they had no equal in wealth and the royal family. This connection can only be beneficial, and besides, people believed that the prince finally had a reliable patron of the people. There was a clear confidence that this girl would become the crown princess in any case. When Janice heard all these rumors, she couldn't help but smile. She was really happy that her plan worked perfectly. Everything was going right. And even if Eric didn't want to show her any attention for now, she thought that it didn't matter. The main thing was that people noticed everything that was needed. Then suddenly, when they began to approach their place of residence, Eric turned to the girl and said that at this ball he would like to officially settle their relationship. That is why he told her about it in advance. You ask what the girl herself thought about it. When Janissa heard about it, she immediately rejoiced, thinking that now he finally understood that he needed her. Therefore, smiling happily, she said that as always, the Pax family will be loyal subjects of the region and obey any order of the prince. Eric, hearing this, smiled and also said that he really liked her unwavering faith. She herself was incredibly happy because he finally became hers. At least that's what Janice thought. When they reached the right place, Eric addressed the guests present and expressed gratitude to everyone who found time in their busy schedules that day and dedicated the event to them. But he especially wanted to express his gratitude to Lady Janice Pax, who greatly adorned this event with her presence. He extended his hand to her so that she could also say her word. Janice smiled happily and put her hand in his and said that for her, it was a big part of it, so she was very glad to be there. Eric said that there was no doubt about it either. Taking this opportunity, he would like to inform everyone about the matter that directly concerned the future of their kingdom. People immediately started to shuffle around. They thought that it would be an announcement of a wedding or just an engagement. However, they were very excited in any case. But the man said that from that day on, in accordance with the changes in the world, the kingdom of Rayhan planned to focus not on livestock farming, which was their main industry, but on production and trade. As soon as the aristocrats heard this, they were very amazed by the man's characteristics. They could not believe that he really wanted to give up their main industry. They did not understand at all why he so suddenly decided to engage in production and trade. Even Karen herself, who heard this, was very surprised. When Janice heard about this, She was the most outraged of all. She turned to the prince and asked what would happen to the Pax family, which was the head of the livestock industry. She couldn't believe what he had said at all or understand what it meant. A few minutes before this, Karen had bumped into a person she knew, and that person turned out to be Paul. When she saw him, she was very surprised and asked what he was doing there. The man laughed nervously, scratched the back of his head and said that he was replacing a representative of the society. He had been sitting out in the village the whole time, so he was told to greet the sponsors. Karen, hearing about this, seriously thought about what he said and replied that this is indeed true. Research requires money, and therefore sponsors are a great option. Then suddenly, half smiling, he said that just a few minutes ago he felt so stuffy in this room that he just wanted to run away. However, he was very glad that he met her. Now he would not be so lonely. But Karen practically didn't listen to him. She suddenly looked to the side where the nut was passing by with Dennis. Paul immediately noticed this, so he looked to the side to understand what exactly she was looking at. Then he saw her student, and seeing a woman next to him, he asked if this really meant that this girl would become the crown princess. Karen said in a very sad voice that perhaps this really would be so. Then they also heard all these rumors that began to spread around and half understood that for some reason they were upsetting her. The man turned to the girl and asked if she was thinking about a relationship or marriage. In general, when Karen heard about this, she was very surprised and asked why he suddenly started asking such questions. Paul already wanted to explain himself. However, the girl eventually said that, in fact, she didn't know. She hadn't thought about it all this time, so she couldn't answer his question. The man already wanted to confess something to her. However, he didn't have time because the crown prince made a very shocking statement, which made it impossible for them to discuss personal matters. Then, when Janice asked him what it meant, the man said that she shouldn't worry about it because he had already seen how her hands even started to shake. Eric smiled and said that the Fax family made a great contribution to animal husbandry, the main industry of the First Order. The man said the royal family, in order to exalt part of the Pax family, wishes to declare their possessions a protected development zone. And those who oppose this, we are trying to discredit the honor of the Pax family, will be considered traitors. He looked sternly at the girl and said that it was my will and also the will of Queen Sinetti. Of course, everyone present was horrified and they could no longer have fun as before. People immediately began to talk among themselves. They knew that the protected development zone meant that it would be difficult not only to develop the land there, but also to build other objects. They thought that the man was going to block all their paths at the moment and did not understand who would want to work with Paxes if they could end up becoming traitors. Of course, Jenny's father also forgot. He was incredibly angry because it meant a lot to him. He immediately began to shout loudly and go closer to the king. The men turned to His Highness and said that he highly valued his vision aimed at the development and future of the Reich, and that it really meant a lot to their country. However, he believed that if their family's lands were immediately declared a development zone, there would be major problems with resource supplies. And this damage will fall entirely on the shoulders of the people. The man said that he is very worried about the work directed against the royal family. When Karen heard all this, she realized that the man was indeed right. She also saw a slight confusion on Eric's face, who clearly did not expect to hear this. Everyone knew that in order to develop production and trade, one could not abandon the primary industry, which was a necessary resource. And the primary industry market was monopolized by the Pax family. And that is why it was difficult for the queen to restrain this family and control all their expenses. Karen noticed that the man said that it was an order from the queen. Therefore, she became very interested in what Eric was thinking about when he made such decisions. Then, after a short silence, the prince finally turned to Marcus Parks and said that his heart caring for the Rian was worthy of admiration, and that is why he would like to give them a little help. He pointed somewhere to the side and said that Marquis Bernard was playing, and the barking decided to support him. Charles Ali bowed, took his wife by the hand, and they went forward to greet the people and explain what they were going to do. When Karen saw these people, she immediately frowned, but in fact, she knew this family very well. Charles said that they would be responsible for supplying resources to help the royal family and the eastern region from his maternal side of the family. And Lily Bernard replied that she would take on the transportation of these resources, the construction of the railway, and the management of all the factories. People, hearing about this, immediately began to happily take advantage of it because they knew that the Eli family owned huge real estate in the east. Some said that they even had mountains with magical stones. And this meant that if the railway was continued, there would definitely be no problems with supplies. The Barnard's family had long been famous for their honesty, so they could be trusted more than the Pax. Eric, who was pleased with his decision, smiled and said that those who shared the goal of this new endeavor could contribute and express their opinion regardless of status and class. When the students heard this, they were very shocked. They had never had the right to speak out on such occasions. Ordinary citizens even thought that they had been called simply as extras, and not so that they could express their requests and wishes on various important occasions. At this point, Paul turned to Karen and said that he didn't quite understand what was going on, so he hoped that she could clarify the situation a little. However, before she could say anything, the man said that he believed that His Highness the Prince of Tel was playing some new game that could be quite dangerous. Karen, who was still very surprised herself, did not respond to this. She did not understand why she had not thought about this before. The girl believed that cooperation with influential families was the best deal. However, now she thought about the fact that apparently her student had surpassed his teacher. At the same time, he turned to Janice and, holding out his hand forward, asked if she would do him the honor of dancing her first dance with him. At that moment, Karen remembered the words of the queen who said that one must be greedy and cunning to not miss anything that falls into one's hands. This is exactly the characteristic that a king should have. She assumed that this was most likely what the queen had meant. When Eric saw the frightened expression on Janice's face, he smiled and said that she basically had no choice there. She simply had to dance with him. Despite the fact that the girl was incredibly angry at this man, she still went to dance with him when the music started playing. They stood in the middle of the hall and began their movements. Eric turned to her and whispered that all this was useful. Thanks to the parties with her, it was easy for him to understand the balance of power in aristocratic society. So he was even somewhat grateful to her for everything. The woman in a toothy voice asked if he really dared to play with her. But the man advised her not to think that she was the loser, because she had marked him out everywhere like a doll and had had a lot of fun. So the girl still got her benefit from all of this. Janice couldn't take all this humiliation anymore, so she hit him on the arm and told him to shut up and asked if he really thought she would just sit back and do nothing. The girl was so emotional that she even accidentally tripped and twisted her leg, but she still managed to stay on her feet for a bit and accidentally pushed over a waiter who was serving drinks to people. The girl decided to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity. She took the broken glass and pointed it straight at Eric, saying that she would not back down so easily. But the man didn't care at all about her threats. Of course, he wasn't afraid of her. So he simply watched all this with a calm expression on his face, stood opposite him, holding his hand with a glass that was broken. There were a lot of sharp ends, so it was incredibly easy to hurt anyone. Karen, seeing that Eric was now in danger, was a little scared. However, she understood that it was best for her not to interfere in all this in order not to arouse great suspicion towards herself. One of the personnel immediately took out a weapon and was going to come to his aid. However, the man said that everything was fine, so they could not interfere with all this. He was going to figure it out himself.